What if the most sacred moment in Christian history was also its most silent 3 days? That's all. From crucifixion to resurrection, 3 days when the Son of God vanished from the world. No sermons, no parables, no miracles, just absence. And when the stone rolled away, something had changed. But what happened inside that tomb? Where did Jesus go? Did he descend into hell, walk among the dead, tear open the gates of Hades, or was it something stranger, something even the early church dared not speak aloud? These aren't just missing hours. They're the lost heartbeat of the gospel. Take a deep breath. Let the echo of that silence settle around you. Because to find the answer, we won't rush. We'll drift through shadows, sift ancient dust, and listen for the voices buried beneath creeds and candles. The story you were taught begins with a cry from the cross and ends with a rolled-back stone. Between them lies a void, a blank page tucked in the holiest book. But in that blankness, according to whispers from the catacombs, visions from forgotten saints, and passages once declared heresy, something happened, something cosmic. The Gospels do not speak of it, but their silence might be the loudest clue of all. You'll hear of doctrines half-remembered and scriptures barely quoted. You'll descend into underworlds lit by torchlight, where souls wait and angels weep. You'll step into tombs not just of stone, but of time itself, places where death is not the end, but a threshold. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You're about to enter a story lost between verses cradled in the hush of 3 vanished days. And once you've entered, you may never see the resurrection the same way again. The Gospels speak with thunder about the crucifixion and trumpet the resurrection with radiant clarity. But between those 2 great moments, they whisper. Or rather, they fall nearly silent. The hours following the burial of Jesus are covered in only the briefest strokes. A stone rolled, a guard placed, the dawn of the 3rd day. That's it. For a faith tradition that hinges on every drop of blood, every syllable from the Savior's mouth, this gap is more than curious. It's unsettling. Because if the story is true, if something unimaginable happened in that tomb, why is no one talking Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John 4 storytellers who seem to disagree on much, but who all treat these 3 days with a strangely coordinated quiet? In Matthew's account, once the tomb is sealed and the guards are posted, the narrative skips straight to Sunday morning. Luke, ever the meticulous historian, provides only a fleeting note that the women rested on the Sabbath. John offers even less. Mark, famously abrupt, provides no details at all. It's as if the curtain drops, the stage lights dim, and we are told to wait for the next act. But behind that curtain, something stirred, something the audience was never allowed to see. Some argue this silence is intentional, a dramatic pause, a Sabbath stillness echoing God's rest after creation. But early Christians didn't seem to treat it as restful. Quite the opposite. In the catacombs and creeds, they began to whisper stories the Gospels had left out. Stories of descent, of confrontation, of liberation. The blank page began to fill not with certainty, but with speculation, art, and eventually doctrine. It is historically established that the earliest complete creedal formulation, the Apostles' Creed, contains a curious phrase, "He descended into hell." This line, though not present in the Gospels, became a central piece of early Christian theology. Church fathers like Irenaeus, Tertullian, and even Augustine debated what it meant, trying to reconcile it with the sacred texts that said so little. Their writings reveal a tension between the canonical silence and the imaginative urgency to explain what Jesus was doing between death and resurrection. Some theologians suggested the descent into hell was metaphorical, a symbol of Christ fully experiencing death. Others claimed it was literal. Jesus entered the realm of the dead to proclaim victory, to rescue the righteous from Sheol, or to confront dark powers directly. These competing views were never fully resolved, and even today, scholars continue to argue whether the silence in the Gospels is a respectful omission or a deliberate concealment. What complicates matters further is the fact that this very gap created fertile ground for texts outside the canon. The Gospel of Nicodemus, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Odes of Solomon. All these writings, composed by early believers or their immediate successors, attempt to fill in the silence. And many of them paint Jesus not as still and lifeless during these days, but active, fierce, even wrathful. The silence they suggest was only on earth. In the underworld, there was a storm. This dissonance has sparked controversy for centuries. Why didn't the gospel writers include more detail? Were these stories known but kept secret, revealed only to initiates? Or had the events been so strange, so difficult to describe, that silence was the only way to honor them? Perhaps it was not a question of theology at all. Perhaps the authors simply didn't know what to say, or weren't allowed to. What's fascinating is that even this lack of description creates a gravitational pull. Scholars and mystics alike have leaned into the gap, hoping to extract meaning from its edges, and what they've discovered or imagined has reshaped Christian thought in ways most believers today have never been told. Because while the Gospels whisper about these 3 days, the imagination of the Church exploded. One obscure yet telling clue comes from the early liturgies of Holy Saturday. While modern services often emphasize waiting and mourning, ancient rites included language of battle descent and light emerging from darkness. A few even portrayed Jesus not lying in repose, but marching into enemy territory. It's a liturgical memory of something not recorded in the Gospels but somehow still passed down. A whisper buried beneath hymns. And that whisper grows louder when we recall the strange scene from Matthew's Gospel immediately following the crucifixion, where the tombs broke open and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. It's mentioned casually, almost as an aside, yet it hints at cosmic disturbance, the dead rising, time unraveling, a power that didn't wait until Sunday morning to make its move. If we take that seriously, then the silence becomes suspicious. Was something happening that could not be explained in linear terms? Something beyond theology and into the mythic, something best left unsaid. The absence of detail in the canonical Gospels might not be due to forgetfulness or reverence, but fear. Fear of misunderstanding, fear of mockery, or perhaps fear of truths so vast they couldn't be confined to parchment. Whatever the reason, the blank space has become sacred territory, a void shaped like a question mark. And so the investigation begins not with a statement, but with a whisper. Not with an answer, but with an invitation to listen, to read between the lines, to trace the outline of a vanished moment and ask what in heaven and on earth was happening while the world thought he slept. It's right there in the Creed, nestled between the crucifixion and the resurrection like a secret passageway. He descended into hell. 4 simple words. Yet for nearly 2 millennia, those words have sparked theological fireworks, ecclesiastical fistfights, and enough speculation to fill a dozen lifetimes. What did it mean? Where did Jesus go? And most confusing of all, was this line always part of the faith or a later addition tucked in to explain what the Gospels refused to say? The phrase didn't appear in the earliest versions of the Apostles' Creed. It crept in later, possibly by the 4th century, and took root like ivy on an old stone wall. By the time of the medieval church, it was treated as gospel truth. Artists painted it. Priests preached it. Peasants imagined their savior kicking down the gates of hell like a divine gladiator. But even as it became tradition, no one could quite agree on what it meant. The Latin phrase used is descendit ad inferos, he descended to the underworld. Not necessarily the place of fire and brimstone that modern minds associate with hell, but more like Sheol Hades, the shadowy realm of the dead. According to ancient Jewish and early Christian thought, this was where all souls went after death, whether righteous or wicked. A holding place. A waiting room with very bad lighting. So did Jesus go there if he did? Why was it a victory parade through enemy territory? A rescue mission, a confrontation with Satan himself? Theologians have offered all of the above. The earliest full explanation comes from 1 Peter 3:19, which cryptically mentions Jesus preaching to the spirits in prison. A line so vague it practically begs for interpretation. Was he offering salvation to the dead, declaring his triumph, or plot twist, condemning the fallen angels from the days of Noah? This ambiguity is both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it allows believers from various traditions to project their theology onto the silence. On the other, it means no one's quite sure what happened, only that something did. Augustine, never one to shy away from metaphysical puzzles, wrestled with this verse and eventually threw up his hands, calling it one of Scripture's most difficult passages. If even Augustine tapped out, you know it's murky, yet not all voices agreed on the descent. The reformer John Calvin argued that Christ's descent into hell wasn't a literal journey, but a spiritual experience. His soul, fully burdened by divine wrath, endured separation from God in a metaphysical sense. Hell for Calvin was not a place, but a state. Luther, ever the poetic dissenter, leaned toward the literal. Christ didn't just die. He invaded death's kingdom, flipped the furniture, and walked out with the keys. The Eastern Orthodox Church took yet another approach. In their tradition, this moment isn't called the descent into hell. It's known as the harrowing of Hades. A beautiful, terrifying phrase. In this version, Jesus breaks open the gates of the underworld, stands amidst the broken chains of death, and lifts up Adam and Eve by the wrists. It's less of a doctrinal footnote and more of a cosmic jailbreak. And in the iconography of the East, it's one of the most beloved images of Christ. But here's the twist that keeps things tangled. The term hell, as used in modern English, blurs multiple ancient concepts. Gehenna, Hades, Sheol, Tartarus, each with distinct meanings, functions, and mythic baggage. So when the Creed says Jesus descended into hell, which one are we talking about? And does mistranslation hide deeper truths? Many scholars now believe the confusion arises from the early church's attempt to merge Jewish eschatology with Greco-Roman cosmology, resulting in a kind of theological smoothie, thick, mysterious, and impossible to unblend. Obscure texts from the 2nd and 3rd centuries offer even wilder interpretations. The Acts of Pilate, later absorbed into the Gospel of Nicodemus, claims that Jesus entered the underworld with a shout so loud it shattered the iron bars of Hades. The devils trembled, death itself recoiled, and the patriarchs Abraham, David, Isaiah gathered around him like schoolchildren, finally set free from the long night of waiting. The story is part epic, part fever dream, and entirely ignored by official canon, which makes it naturally even more intriguing. Modern theologians are divided. Some argue the descent narrative is a metaphor for Christ's full participation in the human condition, including death in its most terrifying form. Others believe it reflects early Christian beliefs in post-mortem evangelism, the idea that Jesus didn't just die for the living, but for the dead as well. A radical idea, especially for those who prefer their eschatology neatly sorted into sheep and goats. Then there's the esoteric view whispered in Gnostic texts and apocalyptic writings that Jesus descended not just into hell, but through layers of unseen realms, battling archons, exposing false gods, reclaiming divine sparks. It's speculative fringe and thoroughly unorthodox, and yet it answers a question the canon dares not touch. If Jesus truly defeated death, what did that battle look like? A curious callback to the silence of the Gospels makes this all the more suspicious. The writers, so eager to narrate the events of Passion Week in slow motion, suddenly jump from Friday evening to Sunday dawn as if Saturday didn't exist. But if the descent into hell is part of the story, if it's real, if it's literal, then Saturday becomes the turning point. Not a day of absence, but of action. And yet we're left with a haunting question. If Christ really did descend into hell, why did he return in silence? Why didn't he speak of it? Share it? Why didn't the gospel writers record his words with the same reverence they gave the Sermon on the Mount? Perhaps they didn't know. Or perhaps, just perhaps, he told them and they chose to forget. Picture this. A locked realm, ancient and cold, filled with the restless dead. Somewhere beyond the veil of breath and heartbeat, the great souls of Israel, Abraham, Moses, David, wait in a twilight neither heaven nor hell. And then without warning, a roar breaks through the gloom. A light tears across the shadow. The gates of death shatter like glass beneath a hammer, and into that forgotten land steps Jesus of Nazareth, not as a ghost, not as a corpse, but as a conqueror. This is the harrowing of Hades. Not just a poetic turn of phrase, but once a foundational belief of the early church. Long before medieval theologians tucked it away as allegory, this idea held court in homilies, icons, and sacred drama. Jesus didn't merely die and rise. He descended to the realm of the dead, kicked down its doors, and set the captives free. It was a rescue mission beneath the skin of the world. The concept is rooted not just in tradition, but in liturgy. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, Holy Saturday was known in some communities not merely as a day of silence, but of descent. Church services reenacted Christ's breaking of the underworld's gates. The Eastern Orthodox iconography still preserves it. Christ straddling the abyss, gripping Adam and Eve by the wrists, not the hands, mind you, but the wrists as if they were drowning. He doesn't wait for their consent. He drags them out. This gesture isn't just artistic. It speaks to a theology of victory, not invitation. In this narrative, Jesus doesn't ask permission. Death has no dominion. Time folds. The righteous of the Old Covenant are liberated not by their waiting, but by his coming. Curiously, this view once appeared to bridge the gap between Jewish expectation and Christian fulfillment. Many Second Temple Jews believed in a multi-layered afterlife Sheol for the dead, with compartments of comfort and torment. Jesus' parable of Lazarus and the rich man reflects this cosmology, a chasm between the righteous dead and the damned, both aware of one another. In this landscape, the harrowing makes emotional and theological sense. Jesus tears the veil not just in the temple, but in the underworld. There is, however, a strange absence in modern Christian consciousness. Ask most believers about the harrowing, and you'll get blank stares or references to fantasy novels. But in the first 5 centuries of the Church, it was taken for granted. Preached, sung, dramatized. Saint Melito of Sardis, in a 2nd century sermon, wrote of, "Christ, he has destroyed death by undergoing death. He has despoiled Hades by descending into Hades. That's not subtle. That's not metaphor. That's a holy jailbreak. And yet this doctrine didn't survive unscathed. Western Christianity, especially after the rise of scholastic theology, began to grow uncomfortable with the idea. As doctrines calcified and catechisms grew precise, the harrowing was demoted from certainty to optional poetry. Protestants in particular struggled with it. Lutherans were torn, some clung to the story, others dismissed it. Calvinists mostly rejected it outright. Theologians argued it had no clear biblical support, forgetting that tradition once carried its own authority. And that's the controversy at the heart of this idea. Historically, there's no doubt it was widely taught, but scripturally, it's cloudy. The passage in 1 Peter 3:19 is notoriously cryptic. Some say it refers to Noah's generation, others to imprisoned spirits of angels, still others to metaphorical proclamation. The ambiguity allowed early Christians to build a story, but later believers craving certainty tried to tear it down. Yet the story persisted. In the Eastern Church, it never really left. To this day, Orthodox Easter services don't just celebrate the resurrection, they sing of Hades being overthrown. The very architecture of Orthodox churches reflects this. The iconostasis, the wall of icons separating altar from nave, contains a central image of the harrowing. Christ striding boldly into death, pulling the dead toward dawn. One obscure but telling detail comes from the Acts of Pilate, a non-canonical text often bundled into the Gospel of Nicodemus. It presents a scene where the personified figure of death complains to Hades that he was tricked, that a man entered his realm, bleeding broken, and then destroyed everything from the inside. It's a kind of divine Trojan horse. Ridiculous, perhaps, but also deeply revealing. Because even outside the canon, early believers longed to express something the official texts left blank, that Christ did not rest. He fought. This doctrine also opens a question modern theology still wrestles with. Did salvation extend backward in time? Could the dead who never knew Jesus be saved? The harrowing says yes, not by their foresight, but by his retroactive grace. Time becomes irrelevant. Mercy rewrites the calendar, but not everyone agreed. Augustine, though fascinated by the descent, ultimately treated it as a one-time event aimed only at the righteous. Thomas Aquinas carved it into scholastic categories. Jesus didn't suffer in hell, he said, but descended in glory. A technicality that feels more like a filing system than a cosmic story. And still today, some theologians avoid the harrowing altogether, treating it like theological fan fiction. Yet despite the lack of consensus, the story haunts the imagination. Maybe because it gives Jesus something to do while dead. Maybe because it makes the resurrection more than a return, it makes it a conquest. Or maybe because deep down, we all want the gates of our private Hades torn open. A quiet callback reveals just how little the canonical Gospels were willing to say. When Jesus tells the thief on the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise," the reader is left puzzled. Was that a metaphor? Or did Jesus really mean today a descent into the place of the dead, not as a victim, but as a king? So the story persists, not because it's proven, but because it's beautiful. Christ didn't just rise, he emptied the underworld on his way up. And maybe, just maybe, that silence in the Gospels wasn't a lack of content. It was reverence. The kind of hush that comes before a rescue. There's a verse in 1 Peter that makes scholars frown, theologians debate, and curious readers raise an eyebrow. It claims that after his death, Jesus went and preached to the spirits in prison. No details, no context. Just a cryptic aside that hangs in the air like incense. Who were these imprisoned spirits? Why were they important enough for Christ to visit between death and resurrection? And most mysteriously, why does this passage echo the Book of Enoch, a text considered sacred by early Christians, but later exiled from the Bible to understand this shadowy moment? you have to step back not just a few pages, but a few centuries. The Book of Enoch, written between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE, offers a cosmic vision so elaborate it makes the Book of Revelation look like a short story. Angels fall from heaven. Giants walk the earth. The Nephilim, offspring of divine beings and human women, corrupt creation. And in the midst of this chaos, Enoch is taken on a tour of the heavens, shown the secrets of the cosmos, and told the fate of the rebellious watchers. These watchers, the fallen angels, are said to be imprisoned in a vast, dark abyss until the final judgment. Their crime teaching humanity forbidden knowledge how to forge weapons, apply makeup, read the stars. Apparently angels don't approve of glittery eyeliner, and it is to these spirits some scholars believe that Christ descended after his death. Not to rescue them, but to declare their defeat, to proclaim that their rebellion had failed, that their power was broken. This interpretation doesn't arise out of nowhere. It was popular in the early church, especially among those who knew the Enochian traditions. Tertullian, for example, treated the Book of Enoch as authoritative, especially on angelic matters. And the Epistle of Jude, in the actual New Testament, quotes Enoch directly, calling him the 7th from Adam and referencing his prophecy of divine judgment. It's like a secret handshake between texts, a wink across the centuries. What makes this all the more tantalizing is that the Book of Enoch was widely read and respected by early Christians, particularly in Egypt and Ethiopia. It was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It shaped the imagination of apocalyptic writers. And yet, by the time the biblical canon was formalized, Enoch was quietly removed. Too weird, too cosmic, too much, and yet, not forgotten. The imagery of Christ proclaiming victory to imprisoned spirits carries deep echoes of Enoch's narrative. In both stories, divine messengers cross the boundaries of the living and dead. In both, rebellious beings are locked away in shadow, and in both the action takes place not on earth or heaven, but in some third space, a prison beneath the cosmos, a place of waiting, weeping, and whispered judgment. The exact nature of Jesus' proclamation remains debated. Was it a triumphal announcement, a gloating confrontation, a final warning, or more radically, an offer of redemption? Some fringe theologians have argued that even the fallen watchers were given a chance to repent. That Christ's descent was not just a military parade, but a universal outreach. It's a moving idea, deeply controversial, of course, but one that highlights just how open the interpretation really is. What's not in dispute is that this idea blurs the line between canon and Apocrypha. It shows how early Christian thought was steeped in a wider world of texts, many of which have since been shelved or silenced. The descent narrative, if read through the lens of Enoch, becomes more than a trip to hell, it becomes a cosmic trial. A confrontation with ancient powers. A retelling of Genesis with Jesus at the center. This might explain why the Gospels remain so tight-lipped about these 3 days. If what happened in the tomb was not merely resurrection, but divine judgment on pre-human rebellion, it's no wonder the evangelists looked away. How do you describe a scene that involves angels in chains and giants beneath the mountains? One obscure clue lies in the architecture of early Christian baptistries. Some of them feature carvings not of Jesus among sheep or with children, but of him trampling monstrous forms underfoot. Serpents, titans, winged beasts. They're not labeled, but one could easily imagine them as the ancient enemies described in Enoch. Baptism for early believers wasn't just a cleansing, it was participation in Christ's victory over these cosmic forces. The same victory he may have enacted in the depths during those missing days. Theologians today remain divided. Some call the Enoch connection interesting but speculative. Others see it as a key to unlocking the strange tension in Peter's epistle. And still others dismiss it entirely, preferring to keep Jesus' descent within the safer boundaries of established doctrine. But one fact is clear: the early church didn't feel the need to separate Scripture from mystery. If anything, it embraced the fog, the tension, the mythic undertone humming beneath the creeds. A callback here draws us once more to the idea of the harrowing not just as a rescue, but as a reckoning. The harrowing may have included a descent past the souls of the righteous and down to the abyss of the fallen. Not all chains were broken. Some were tightened, and so the silence of the Gospels deepens not with absence but with implication. If Christ visited the watchers in their prison, the implications are vast. It means the crucifixion was not merely about humanity. It was about cosmic justice, ancient sin, the restoration of a broken order. Which leads us to one final question. For now, if Christ confronted the ancient rebels beneath creation, did anything follow him back? Before the creeds were codified, before councils ruled on canon, and long before theologians tried to sanitize the mysteries of the tomb, there were paintings. Scratched into stone, etched onto walls by candlelight, hidden in the catacombs beneath cities where believers whispered and waited. And in those images, silent, sacred, surviving, where sermons have vanished, Christ is not lying still. He is standing, walking, reaching into darkness. Early Christian art didn't shy away from the question the Gospels left unanswered. In fact, it leaned into it. The oldest depictions of Jesus between death and resurrection don't show him in repose, swaddled in burial cloths. They show him in motion, often barefoot, sometimes radiating light, always active. This is not a Christ at rest. This is a Christ on a mission. The Roman catacombs that labyrinth beneath the empire's feet offer some of the most striking examples. In shadowy frescoes from the 3rd and 4th centuries, Jesus appears with outstretched arms, pulling Adam and Eve from their graves. He stands over shattered doors and broken locks, while dark horned figures recoil in the corners. No text accompanies these images. They didn't need words. The visual language was enough. Christ descended. He conquered. He came back with souls in tow. The peculiar thing is how consistent this imagery is. Across regions and centuries, in Rome and Cappadocia, in Ravenna, artists returned again and again to this moment. Not the crucifixion, not the resurrection, but the in-between, the descent, the liberation, the harrowing. Even more curious is the way this visual tradition blossomed while the Gospels remained silent. As if believers knew intuitively that something had happened and found it easier to paint than to preach. After all, sermons require approval. Paintings, especially those hidden underground, do not. One obscure piece found in the Chapel of the Sacrament in the Catacomb of Calixtus shows a robed figure standing at the threshold of what appears to be a cave, light spilling behind him, hands raised as if commanding obedience. The figures around him are shadowy, indistinct, but they appear to be bowing. Some scholars believe this is an early depiction of Christ addressing the dead. Others argue it's symbolic of resurrection. Either way, the implication is clear: he went somewhere. He did something. The tradition becomes even richer in the East. In Byzantine mosaics, Christ is sometimes shown descending with a cross slung over his shoulder like a weapon. Beneath his feet are the shattered gates of Hades, twisted like discarded armor. The figure of death lies bound, his keys scattered. It's not subtle, nor is it meant to be. In one particularly vivid mosaic from the Kora Church in Istanbul, Christ is in mid-motion pulling Adam from the grave while Eve waits just behind. His robes flare behind him like a comet, golden and alive. And there's a detail easy to miss. His hand doesn't grasp Adam's hand. It grips his wrist, not gently, commandingly, as if to say, "You're not staying here, not anymore." This motif, the wrist grasp, has become a quiet iconographic standard. And it echoes something mentioned in the previous exploration. This is not rescue by request. It is rescue by right. The theological implications are significant. Art, unlike theology, doesn't argue. It reveals. And what it reveals here is a belief that Jesus' death wasn't passive, that something dynamic and cosmic took place beneath the surface, that while the disciples mourned and Rome slept, Christ was tearing through the underworld like a king returning from exile. Yet the most controversial detail isn't what's present in these works, it's what's absent. There are few, if any, images of Christ alone in the tomb. No depictions of him lying still in darkness, no serene corpse awaiting dawn. The early Christian imagination simply refused to believe he was idle. The silence of Scripture was answered with visual defiance, and it didn't stop at catacombs. In the early medieval period, manuscript illuminations and carved reliquaries carried the theme forward. Christ's descent was shown not just as doctrine but as drama. He strides into limbo, banners raised, devils fleeing. It's almost theatrical, and yet profoundly devotional. One piece, a lesser-known ivory carving from the 9th century, depicts Christ entering the realm of the dead, not with soldiers or saints, but alone. His face is calm. His hand reaches down. Beneath him, the door to some ancient prison is buckling. And to the side, the personification of Hades cowers not in rage, but in fear. And here the callback to that strange phrase from 1 Peter becomes unavoidable. Preaching to the spirits in prison. In the visual imagination of early Christianity, this wasn't metaphor, it was movement. Christ walked into the very place the world feared most and began to preach. Not to convert, to proclaim. It's this subtle shift from stillness to proclamation that changes everything. If Christ's time in the tomb was filled with movement and speech, then those 3 days aren't just missing, they're hidden. They are the point. Of course, controversy still lingers. Some modern scholars see these images as purely symbolic metaphors for spiritual liberation, not metaphysical travel. Others argue they reflect a lost strand of theology that the Church quietly buried. And some just shrug, uncomfortable with a Jesus who descends rather than ascends. But the art remains. Unapologetic, uncensored. Whispering a truth that can't be footnoted, that Christ may have gone farther than anyone imagined. That the tomb was not a stopover, but a battlefield. And that beneath every quiet cathedral lies the echo of chains breaking. It begins with Pilate washing his hands, but it doesn't end where the Gospels do. Instead, it keeps going downward, past Golgotha, beneath the stone, into a world the canonical texts barely touch. The Gospel of Nicodemus, also called the Acts of Pilate, is an apocryphal gospel stitched together from earlier oral traditions, legends, and theological drama. It's not officially recognized, but for centuries it was believed, read aloud, and even copied by monks who probably raised an eyebrow as they inked its more dramatic passages. Because in this account, Jesus doesn't sleep in death. He storms hell. According to the narrative, once Christ gives up his spirit, a great uproar is heard in the underworld. The realm of the dead begins to tremble. 2 disembodied figures, named as the patriarchs Simeon and his sons, arrive to report something astonishing. A divine figure is on the way, shining with unbearable light. Panic spreads among the fallen angels and the rulers of Hades. Lucifer himself grows nervous. Death, personified as a separate entity, begins to question the strength of his kingdom. It's not often that hell itself experiences dread. The Gospel imagines a vivid, almost theatrical drama between death and Satan. One the jailer, the other the tempter. They argue like anxious criminals. Death insists his gates are impenetrable. Satan isn't so sure, and then the shout comes. A voice like thunder echoes through the shadows. Lift up your gates, O princes, and be ye lifted up, O everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. In this retelling, Jesus does not whisper, he does not knock, he breaks in. The moment he enters is written like an explosion of light. Iron bars crumble, bronze hinges melt, the darkness flees, the captives rejoice, and Jesus, described as clothed in unspeakable light, walks into the abyss not as a victim, but as its undoing. He reaches for Adam first, then Eve, then the prophets, patriarchs, and righteous souls who had long waited in Abraham's bosom. The gates of death are not merely opened, they're destroyed. One obscure but powerful detail in this account is the role of John the Baptist. In the Gospel of Nicodemus, John appears as a forerunner even in death. He announces Christ's arrival to the souls below, fulfilling his role from life in the realm of the dead. This continuity of mission, a prophet preparing the way even beyond the grave, adds a surreal weight to the scene. It's theatrical, yes, but also oddly consistent with the roles we've come to expect. The dramatic irony of the story is almost playful. While soldiers guard the tomb in Jerusalem, the real battle takes place unseen beneath their feet. The world thinks Christ is defeated. Meanwhile, he's marching through the realm of the dead like a warrior returning from exile. There's something almost mischievous in the narrative structure. The devil was outplayed. Again. But why then is this account not more widely known? Why has it been buried like the tomb it describes? The answer lies in its timing and its tone. The Gospel of Nicodemus likely reached its final form in the 4th century, just as the canon was closing. While the early church had some flexibility in what stories could be shared, the rising power of bishops and councils began to demand uniformity. Anything too imaginative, too mythical, too prone to public spectacle was quietly shelved. And yet this story endured. It was copied across Europe and the Near East. In medieval mystery plays, it became the basis for whole theatrical performances with devils in chains and Christ in shining armor. The people remembered even if the councils preferred they didn't. Theologically, it raised uncomfortable questions. If Jesus truly harrowed hell, what did that mean for the souls of the dead? Did they hear the gospel in the grave? Were the gates permanently broken? And what of the damned? Were they offered a choice, a second chance? These weren't questions the institutional church wanted circulating freely. The line between liberation and universalism blurred quickly. Better perhaps to let the canonical Gospels keep their silence. And yet, a subtle callback draws us back to the earliest creeds. He descended into hell. A phrase that, though brief, is expanded and dramatized in the Gospel of Nicodemus into something cosmic. Not a metaphor, a war. What's particularly haunting is the silence that follows. According to this narrative, Christ leads the captives out, the gates shut behind him. But there is no record of what he said when he returned. No testimony from the rescued. No dialogue in the Gospels describing the aftermath. The noise of hell's defeat is followed by the silence of the tomb until, of course, the stone rolls away. Modern scholars often dismiss the Gospel of Nicodemus as pious fiction, but fiction has a funny way of revealing what doctrine obscures. The fact that this story resonated so widely suggests something deeper than entertainment. Perhaps in the absence of canonical clarity, the people filled in the silence with something they hoped had happened. Or more provocatively, something they'd always known had happened, but could no longer say aloud. The tension between this gospel and the official narrative isn't just historical, it's emotional. In the canonical Gospels, the 3 days in the tomb are quiet, still, and deeply lonely. In Nicodemus's account, they are loud, blazing, triumphant. One feels like grief, the other like revenge, which raises a final question. For now, what if both are true? What if Christ lay still in body, yet stormed the gates in spirit? What if the silence of the tomb was only on this side of the veil? 3 days, that's the promise. On the third day, he will rise again. It's repeated across the Gospels like a refrain, a prophecy fulfilled, a timeline set in divine stone. But what exactly does 3 days mean? Is it a literal 72-hour period, a poetic expression, or a theological device used to echo older patterns? Jonah in the fish, Hosea's prophecy, the rhythm of creation itself. It's the sort of question that sounds nitpicky at first. But dig just a little and you find yourself in a rabbit hole of Jewish reckoning, Roman calendars, symbolic storytelling, and a timekeeping system that makes your smartphone calendar look like ancient runes. Let's start with the historical framework. According to the Gospel accounts, Jesus died on a Friday afternoon, what we now call Good Friday. He was buried quickly before sundown as the Sabbath was beginning. Then, early on Sunday morning, women arrived to find the tomb empty. From Friday afternoon to Sunday morning is at most a day and a half. 2 nights. Not 3 days by modern reckoning. Not even close to the full 72 hours that might be expected if we take the prophecy literally. But here's the twist. Ancient Jewish timekeeping didn't work like ours. In their system, any part of a day could count as a whole day. It's a principle known as inclusive reckoning, so Friday afternoon counts as day 1. Saturday is day 2. And early Sunday morning, despite being just a few hours, is day 3. Technically speaking, the Gospels follow that logic. It's not a mistake. It's just frustratingly imprecise to modern ears. This interpretation has been upheld by centuries of theologians who are understandably eager to preserve both scriptural integrity and historical plausibility. But it raises deeper questions. Why 3 days? Why this span? What did it mean? Because here's where it gets eerie. The number 3 recurs again and again in sacred literature, and not by accident. Jonah spent 3 days and nights in the belly of the great fish, a story Jesus himself directly parallels in Matthew's Gospel. Hosea, speaking for God, declared, "After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up." Resurrection stories in Jewish and pagan traditions often follow this same rhythm. There's something archetypal about 3 days of death followed by return. It's long enough to signal real loss, but not so long that all hope is gone. The pattern reaches even deeper. In Egyptian mythology, Osiris is murdered, dismembered, and restored over a 3-day period. In Greek tales, Persephone is rescued from the underworld after a triadic cycle. The cosmos seems to hum with the idea that death, if not reversed by the third day, becomes permanent. Day 1 is trauma. Day 2 is silence. Day 3 is decision. And yet within this familiar pattern lies a jarring inconsistency. If we're being honest, the gospel timelines don't quite match. Mark seems to suggest a straightforward 3-day countdown. Matthew emphasizes the third day. Luke makes it even less precise. And John, always the mystic, plays fast and loose with time, focusing more on imagery than on chronology. The result, an uneasy tension between theological symbolism and historical sequence. An obscure but telling fragment from the early church father Hippolytus adds a layer of intrigue. Writing in the 3rd century, he proposed that the 3 days were not merely physical, but cosmological, mirroring the 3 realms Christ traversed: earth, the underworld, and the heavens. Each day corresponds to a journey. Each night a gate crossed. It's poetic, yes. But it also attempts to resolve the awkward mathematics by spiritualizing the passage of time. Which raises a controversial point. What if the 3 days weren't intended to be clocked at all? What if they were a mythic frame, a scaffold for mystery, not a stopwatch? In other words, what if we're not meant to measure them, but to feel them? This view has gained traction in recent years, particularly among theologians uncomfortable with literalist readings. They argue that demanding exact hours and minutes from ancient texts misses the point. The tomb narrative isn't about tracking Jesus' pulse. It's about descent and return, about darkness and dawn. It follows a rhythm older than calendars, something primal, something liturgical. And yet the tension remains. If the gospel writers were comfortable with symbolic time, why go out of their way to mention the 3rd day so frequently? Why not just say after a little while or sometime later? The insistence on that particular phrasing suggests a structure, a prophecy fulfilled, something that had to happen on schedule. Here's where the callback becomes impossible to ignore. In the Gospel of Nicodemus, the realm of the dead begins to stir as soon as Christ's Spirit departs. The gates creak, the patriarchs prepare. Time in that narrative bends inward. The 3 days become more than duration, they become momentum, a gathering storm. Which may explain why the Gospels, though sparse on detail, cling so tightly to the timeline. Not because it's literal, but because it's liturgical. Modern readers want precision. Early believers wanted rhythm. And in the echo between the two, something slips through. A final point, obscure yet fascinating in medieval Christian mysticism, some texts suggest that time within the tomb unfolded differently. That what we perceive as 3 days may have for Christ been timeless, or even infinite. One mystic wrote that the tomb was a chamber of the stars, a pocket outside chronology, where the battle with death took place across all epochs. It's poetic, yes, but oddly in tune with modern physics. Time dilation, nonlinear events, eternal moments compressed into days. So was it 3 literal days, maybe? Was it symbolic? Certainly. Was it more than both? Almost definitely. Because in the end, the question of how long Christ lay in the tomb may not be about duration at all. It may be about the weight of waiting, the kind of pause that fractures time, a stillness that changes the calendar. A silence measured not in hours, but in the turning of the world. The tomb was borrowed, the burial rushed, and the Sabbath looming. When Jesus of Nazareth was taken down from the cross, it wasn't just a matter of reverence, it was a race against the clock. In Jewish tradition, burial was not optional. It was an obligation. The dead had to be interred before sundown, especially before the Sabbath, when labor, including burial, was forbidden. But behind this rush behind the stone rolled in haste there lies a deeper question. How much do we really know about what happened in that burial chamber? And what clues might ancient Jewish customs offer about the hours that followed? First, the basics. It is a well-established historical fact that first-century Jewish burial practices involved a 2-stage process. The body would be washed, anointed with perfumes, or oils wrapped in linen and placed in a rock-hewn tomb. After a year or so, the bones would be gathered and placed in an ossuary, a stone box for permanent rest. This tradition is confirmed by archaeological finds throughout Judea and by contemporary writings such as the Mishnah. But in Jesus' case, everything was accelerated. He died at roughly the 9th hour around 3 p.m., and the Sabbath began at sunset. That left just a few hours to prepare the body, secure the tomb, and retreat. Joseph of Arimathea, a secret follower of Jesus, offered his own tomb, a generous and politically risky act. Nicodemus, who once visited Jesus under cover of night, brought a staggering amount of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds by John's account. That detail has puzzled historians. Was it an exaggeration, a symbolic number? Or was it a real, overwhelming quantity meant to suggest royal treatment? Regardless, the body was wrapped in linen, sealed in a tomb, and left in the darkness. But here's where the gaps begin. According to Mark and Luke, the women who followed Jesus prepared spices and perfumes after the burial, intending to return after the Sabbath to complete the anointing. This suggests that the initial burial was incomplete, perhaps only a partial ritual done in haste. The stone, once rolled into place, became both a seal and a deadline. So what does this tell us? For one, that the tomb may not have been a place of stillness. If the burial was rushed, then the usual rituals of mourning and preparation were disrupted, perhaps even intentionally so. Some scholars have wondered if the women returning Sunday morning were doing more than grieving, they were completing a rite that had been interrupted. And this leads to one of the more obscure details, the possibility of re-entry. In typical first-century tombs, the rolling stone was not impossible to move. Heavy, yes, but not immovable, especially if multiple people were involved. That the women question among themselves who will roll the stone away for us indicates not just fear, but intent. They planned to go in. They believed they could. That idea complicates the usual image of a sealed, inviolate tomb. It may have been accessible, at least theoretically, during the time Jesus was believed to be resting inside. Did anyone attempt to visit? Did anyone dare? Another curious custom from the period was the practice of leaving the face of the deceased exposed for a short time. This allowed mourners a final moment with the departed, sometimes even into the first day of burial. In some traditions, the stone might not have been sealed tightly until the following evening. It's speculative, but possible. And if that's true, then the timeline of events inside the tomb could be more dynamic than we imagine. The callback to the shroud, or rather the linen wrappings, becomes more significant here. If Jesus was indeed wrapped in cloth, saturated with oils and aloes, and then left in a cool, enclosed space, the possibility of some kind of reaction, chemical, environmental, or otherwise, has long fascinated scientists. The Shroud of Turin, whether authentic or not, shows signs of such interaction. Could the very conditions of the burial, hasty, aromatic, sealed, have played a role in what appeared later? But perhaps the most compelling angle lies in what was not done. Under Jewish law, the dead were not to be left exposed or unburied. Yet Jesus, executed as a criminal, could have been denied burial altogether. That he wasn't that respected men of the council arranged for his body suggests an undercurrent of quiet rebellion within the system. The act of burying him properly was itself a protest, a sacred interruption of Roman brutality. And in that gesture, something subtle occurred. The tomb became a threshold. Not just a resting place, but a portal. A final overlooked point. The timing of Jesus' death and burial coincided with Passover. A festival soaked in themes of liberation, blood on the doorposts, and death passing over the homes of the faithful. The symbolic alignment is striking. Just as lambs were slain and homes sealed in Egypt, so too was this Lamb of God wrapped and sealed in stone. Was the timing coincidental? Or were the Gospel writers weaving history into a larger narrative of escape not from Pharaoh, but from death itself? The idea brings us to a tension still present in the story. The tomb was meant to hold death in place, but everything about Jewish burial practice emphasized transition, movement. A year later, bones would be gathered, names would be inscribed. The tomb was never the end. It was a waiting room, a quiet place of becoming. Which leads to a provocative possibility. Perhaps what happened during those 3 days was not abnormal at all, but the fulfillment of what burial always pointed toward. Perhaps the tomb was never meant to contain. Perhaps it was always meant to open. The tomb was sealed. Guards were posted. Rome doesn't take chances, especially not with public executions, followed by whispers of resurrection. And yet by Sunday morning, the stone had been rolled away, the body was gone, and the only thing left behind was folded linen. It's a detail that's been debated, dramatized, and diagrammed for 2,000 years. But beneath the surface of the Sunday school version lies a more tangled story. Because what really happened to the body of Jesus during those 3 days? And just how secure was that tomb? According to the Gospel of Matthew, after the burial, the chief priests and Pharisees approached Pilate. They remembered that Jesus had predicted his own resurrection and worried that his followers might attempt to steal the body and claim the prophecy fulfilled. So they requested a guard be stationed at the tomb. Pilate, ever the bureaucrat, gave a dismissive yet cryptic reply. "You have a guard. Go make it as secure as you know how." Now here's where the history gets messy. Was this a Roman guard or a temple guard assigned by the Sanhedrin? Roman soldiers would have been strictly accountable. Falling asleep on duty was punishable by death. Temple guards, however, were far less formal. The ambiguity of Pilate's words has led to centuries of debate, because the nature of the guard dramatically changes the story's stakes. Matthew goes further. Not only was a guard stationed, but a seal was placed on the stone. This wasn't a waxy red sticker like something from a spy movie. It was likely a cord or rope stretched across the stone, fixed with clay or lead imprints on either side, an official mark of Roman authority. Breaking the seal wasn't just disrespectful, it was treason. And yet by Sunday morning it was broken. The earliest Gospel, Mark, doesn't mention the guard at all. Nor does Luke. Nor does John. Only Matthew includes the story of the seal, the watch, and the ensuing panic. This discrepancy has led some scholars to suggest the guard narrative was added later, perhaps, as a counter to early claims that the body had been stolen. It may have been apologetic defensive storytelling meant to address critics of the resurrection narrative. But that doesn't make it fictional, just pointed. The real question is whether the presence of the guard implies something had to be guarded, and if so, whether the precautions suggest knowledge of something more than simple body snatching. After all, if the disciples were scattered, frightened, and in hiding, how likely were they to stage an elaborate heist? One obscure yet revealing clue lies in the reaction of the guards themselves. According to Matthew, they experienced an earthquake and a vision, a being like lightning descending from heaven. They were so frightened they became like dead men, and then curiously they vanished from the narrative. Poof. Just like the body. Later, they reappear in a brief epilogue, bribed by the chief priests to spread the story that the disciples stole the body while they slept. But here's where the story starts to wobble. If they were sleeping, how did they know who took it, and why weren't they punished? Roman military culture was not known for leniency. If these were Roman soldiers who failed in their duty, whether by fear, sleep, or deception, they would not have walked away with hush money. Unless something had happened that was so far outside protocol, it couldn't be explained in any report. This leads to one of the most enduring questions. Was the tomb ever actually secure? Archaeological evidence from first-century tombs in Judea shows that the rolling stone used to seal entrances was large but movable. Typically placed in a sloped groove, it could be pushed into place with effort, but rolling it away was significantly harder, especially from the outside. Add to that the guard, the seal, and the political tension of the Passover season, and you'd think no one could possibly approach that tomb unnoticed. And yet someone or something did. The callback to burial customs is key here. The stone was meant to seal the body, not imprison a soul. And in Jewish tradition, the grave was sacred space not to be disturbed. The idea that a group of fearful disciples would risk their lives to fake a resurrection they barely understood strains plausibility. Even if they had done it, where would they have taken the body? And why would they all later go to their deaths, refusing to recant? One detail from John's Gospel deserves closer attention. When Peter and the beloved disciple arrive at the tomb, they find the linen wrappings lying there and the face cloth folded separately. That's not the sign of a hasty robbery. That's a message, a choice, a moment of order left behind in the aftermath of something unexplainable. Which brings us to the controversial question that has haunted theologians and skeptics alike: did the body vanish, or did it move? Some suggest a spiritual resurrection, that Jesus' body remained but his essence transformed. Others argue for a bodily resurrection, but one that defied physics. A third group, more esoteric, proposes that the tomb was never meant to be a container, but a passage, a portal, a threshold between dimensions where matter bends and time stutters. Outlandish, maybe, but no more so than a dead man walking through locked doors a few days later. A lesser-known early tradition claims that the guards never saw the resurrection itself. They felt the tremor. They saw the light. But the exact moment of transformation was hidden, shielded by the stone. Whatever happened, it happened unseen, just as the Gospels remain silent about what transpired in the darkness between death and dawn. And that silence echoes louder than any shout, because here we stand at the edge of knowing. The tomb was sealed, then open. The body was there, then gone. The guards were vigilant, then terrified. In that blur of contradiction lies the mystery itself. The vanishing wasn't just of a corpse. It was of certainty, of control, of the idea that death follows rules, and from that moment on, nothing did. It was the only thing left behind. Not a body, not a note, just linen, folded orderly and untouched by time. When Peter and the beloved disciple entered the tomb on that dim morning, they didn't find a corpse, they found fabric. For many, this is a throwaway detail, a subtle nod to the resurrection. But for others, for mystics, scholars, and even forensic scientists, it's the beginning of another mystery. Because linen doesn't vanish, it records. It holds scent stain imprint. And this particular cloth may tell us more about what happened inside the tomb than any eyewitness ever could. According to John's Gospel, the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was found folded up in a place by itself. That sentence has puzzled readers for centuries. Why include such a minor detail? Why bother describing the arrangement of burial wrappings unless it meant something? In Jewish burial, custom linen wrappings were used to shroud the body, tightly combined with spices and aromatic oils. The headcloth or sudarium was often tied separately to cover the face. If Jesus had been removed by grave robbers, one would expect the linen to be in disarray or gone entirely. Robbers don't fold. They flee. They don't leave the most sacred, damning evidence behind in pristine condition. The neatness is unsettling, like someone cleaned up before leaving. Some theologians interpret the folded cloth as symbolic, a sign of deliberate departure, not escape. A calling card left for the disciples, indicating that death had been not undone, but outgrown. But beyond metaphor lies something far stranger, something that has captivated believers and skeptics alike: the Shroud of Turin. The shroud, a 14-foot linen cloth bearing the faint image of a crucified man, has long been associated with the burial of Jesus. While it isn't explicitly mentioned in the Bible, its existence has been traced back to at least the 14th century, and possibly earlier. What makes it unique is the image itself. It's not painted. It's not scorched. It appears to be a photographic negative produced by some unknown process that burned a faint three-dimensional image into the very surface of the fibers. If the shroud is genuine, and that is still hotly debated, it may represent the closest thing we have to a snapshot of the resurrection. Not a painting, but a residue. A record of whatever happened in that tomb. And here's where things get unsettling. Some scientists who have studied the shroud have proposed that the image could only have been created by a brief burst of radiant energy, something that affected the cloth at a microscopic level, without disturbing the underlying weave. One researcher even compared it to a short-range radiation event. Imagine that light, not from a lamp, but from something akin to a controlled detonation. A resurrection, not just of spirit, but of matter. Not metaphor, but metamorphosis. Of course there are doubts. Carbon dating tests in 1988 suggested the shroud originated in the Middle Ages. But those tests have been criticized, especially since the sample taken came from a section likely repaired in the 1300s. Newer tests, less publicized, have pointed to older origins. The debate remains unresolved. But even if the shroud is a medieval relic, the question remains, why was it made with such inexplicable precision? And how did it become the object of such deep veneration? Adding to the mystery is the Sudarium of Oviedo, a separate cloth said to be the face covering mentioned in John's Gospel. This relic, held in Spain, bears bloodstains that some believe match the wounds seen on the Shroud of Turin. The two cloths have similar blood types, matching points of trauma and histories that, if true, extend back to the early centuries of Christianity. Coincidence? Or a fragmented record of a burial that defies history? But perhaps the most haunting question isn't about the cloth itself, but about what it witnessed. If the linen remained in place while the body disappeared, how did it collapse gently as the physical form within it simply ceased to be? Did it flare with light? Was there sound? Was there time? A peculiar callback to the Book of Enoch and the Watchers slips back into frame here. If Jesus descended to proclaim victory to imprisoned spirits, as some suggest, could the body have remained behind while the spirit journeyed? Or more radically, did the linen wrap an absence, not a presence, from the very start? Some Gnostic writings flirt with this idea that Christ's true essence was never bound by flesh, that what lay in the tomb was more shadow than substance. Yet the cloth itself doesn't point to absence. It points to transformation. Whatever lay within it left a mark, not torn, not scorched, but altered. An imprint so subtle it couldn't be seen until the invention of photographic negatives in the 19th century. It's as if the evidence was always there, waiting for humanity to invent the language to understand it. And that's perhaps the strangest part of all. The linen, silent, folded, and forgotten, has become the loudest testimony. While the Gospels remain coy about what happened in the tomb, the cloth does not. It tells of violence, of stillness, of something radiant and strange erupting from within, a quiet monument to the idea that death, once wrapped and sealed, was not broken but outgrown. So what happened in the tomb? No one saw it. No one wrote it down. and yet something remains. A cloth bearing a shadow, a fold placed deliberately, a silence wrapped in linen. And when the disciples entered that space, they didn't just see emptiness. They saw order. They saw meaning. And for the first time, they believed. There's a reason the Book of Enoch was quietly shuffled off the canonized stage. It's unsettling, filled with angels who don't behave, with giants who corrupt the earth, and with God's judgment rendered not just on humans, but on beings that should have known better. And in the shadow of Jesus' 3 missing days, the Watchers, those ancient rebellious angels, start to look less like background lore and more like players in a cosmic reckoning. Because according to some early interpretations, Christ's descent during the tomb days wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a confrontation. The Watchers are introduced in Enoch as angels who descended in the days of Jared and took human wives. Their offspring, the Nephilim, were giants, both in size and in corruption. These creatures taught humanity things it wasn't meant to know: sorcery, warfare, vanity. The world, poisoned by their influence, descended into chaos. As punishment, God cast the Watchers into a subterranean prison, locking them in the valleys of the earth until the final judgment, in chains, in silence, waiting. It is a historical fact that the idea of imprisoned angels was widespread among Second Temple Jews. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance, reference these fallen beings, often linking them to apocalyptic judgment and divine wrath. But here's where things start to tangle. In 1 Peter 3:19-20, the epistle says that Jesus, after being made alive in the Spirit, went and preached to the spirits in prison who were disobedient in the days of Noah. That's oddly specific. It doesn't say human souls. It says spirits. It doesn't say they sinned in general. It ties them directly to the flood. That's Watcher language. Some scholars insist this passage simply reflects ancient cosmology, strange theology that evolved and got cleaned up later. Others believe it preserves a tradition that has since been buried, that during those 3 days, Jesus didn't just visit the righteous dead. He went deeper, to the lowest levels, to the old prisons. And what he did there was not proclaim peace. It was judgment. There's a strange echo here, a callback to the Gospel of Nicodemus and its dramatization of Christ confronting death and Hades as personified entities. Could this mythic descent also include the Watchers, those forgotten traitors of heaven? If so, it reframes the tomb as more than a quiet chamber. It becomes a courtroom, a battlefield, maybe even a dungeon raid. One obscure but remarkable thread can be found in a fragment of the Book of the Secrets of Enoch, in which the righteous dead are shown different levels of heaven and hell. The lowest level, a dark pit where angels scream bound in chains. It is a place outside time where only judgment waits. And if Jesus descended to such a place even briefly, his presence would have been not comfort, but terror. Early Christian thinkers didn't shy away from this possibility. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and even Clement of Alexandria speculated about Christ's cosmic reach, his ability to address not just humanity's fall, but the entire spiritual rebellion. Some Gnostic sects took it further, painting Jesus as a liberator of sparks, breaking into the false world built by blind archons. It's theology by thunderstorm, wild and uncontainable. What's important here is that this idea, though bizarre to modern ears, wasn't fringe in the early church. It was woven into the very tapestry of early Christian imagination. The idea that Jesus' victory wasn't just over death, but over every power that had ever defied heaven. And this brings us to a lesser-known, yet deeply unsettling interpretation, that the tomb itself, the place where Jesus lay, was directly over one of these gates. that his body rested atop not just a stone slab, but a prison door. A place where, according to apocalyptic geography, the Watchers were chained. There's no archaeological proof, of course, just a poetic alignment, but for early mystics it made terrifying sense. Of course the resurrection happened there. Of course the world shook. The idea of the tomb as a cosmic fault line adds new dimension to the moment when the earth quaked and the rocks were split. That's not just poetic flourish. That's the ground responding to something ancient being undone. And if that's true, if Jesus confronted the Watchers in their prison, then we have to ask, why was it simply to proclaim their defeat? Or was there something to retrieve? One fringe theory found in a handful of early Syriac texts suggests that the Watchers, though cursed, still held knowledge. Forbidden names, hidden truths, power that could only be accessed through confrontation. It's the kind of idea that sounds like the opening act of a fantasy novel. But within the context of apocalyptic theology, it fits the pattern. Descent, confrontation, victory, return. A subtle callback to the cloth in the tomb, folded, quiet, deliberate gains new resonance here. Because if Jesus emerged, not just from death, but from a victory over primeval powers, the quiet arrangement of linen may have been a signature, a seal broken but not in haste, a record that something had happened there which the living could not understand, but the powers beneath surely did. Controversial, absolutely. But then again, the entire resurrection narrative is already a violation of every natural law. Why stop at human death? Why not confront the whole cosmic system that brought death into the world in the first place? The Watchers, long forgotten by most believers, may still whisper beneath the story. Not because they matter more than the cross or the empty tomb, but because their chains rattling in the background remind us that the resurrection wasn't just a return to life. It was a total reset, a cosmic mutiny, a savior stepping over thresholds the world never knew existed and turning out the lights in every prison on his way back up. Buried deep within the pages of the Babylonian Talmud, among legal debates, ritual commentary, and theological jabs, there's a strange little passage. It's short, cryptic, and feels like a grenade tossed into the margins of history. It speaks of Yeshu, a man who led Israel astray, who was hanged on the eve of Passover, and who before his execution was offered a chance to recant. No one came forward to defend him, so he was condemned. And in one line stark and cutting, the Talmud claims that this man now burns in boiling excrement in the afterlife. Not exactly Sunday school material. For centuries, Christian scholars read this with indignation. Here, they said, was proof that the rabbis of late antiquity hated Jesus, that they mocked him, that they twisted history into insult. But others quietly, cautiously wondered something else. Could it be that beneath the venom, a fragment of truth remained, a warped echo of an earlier tradition, a clue to the missing days, first the history? The Babylonian Talmud was compiled between the 3rd and 6th centuries CE, long after Jesus' death. It reflects the teachings of rabbis scattered across the Jewish diaspora, especially in Persia. Its tone is defensive, often sarcastic, and reflects the trauma of a community navigating life under Christian imperial power. References to Jesus, if they are indeed to that Jesus, are deliberately veiled. Yeshu is not uncommon as a name. The stories are vague, but the parallels are striking. In Tractate Sanhedrin 43a, a man named Yeshu is said to have practiced sorcery and led Israel into apostasy. He was executed, and for 40 days a herald went out crying that anyone who could defend him should come forward. No one did. So he was hanged on the eve of Passover. The timing, the charges, even the method, though, hanged here, likely refers to crucifixion all align uncomfortably well with the gospel narrative. But it's the afterlife mention that catches the breath. In another tractate, Gittin 57a, a spirit identified as Yeshu is described as being punished in the afterlife by being boiled in excrement. The imagery is grotesque, meant as the ultimate insult, but in its own twisted way, it acknowledges something profound, that this figure had gone somewhere after death, that he had descended, and that his presence post-mortem still mattered. Now one could easily dismiss this as polemic, a nasty religious jab from one side of a centuries-old feud. And that's fair. The tone is mocking, not mystical. But even mockery requires a template. One doesn't ridicule what one has never heard of, and the idea of Jesus descending into the underworld, facing judgment, being present among the dead, was well known among early Christians. The rabbis may have heard these stories and reworked them, turning glory into punishment, inverting theology into satire. This leads to a historical fact that often goes unmentioned. Early Christian and rabbinic communities were not cleanly divided. In the first few centuries, they overlapped, argued, shared cities, texts, even relatives. The line between heretic and neighbor was often blurred. It's entirely possible that rabbinic writers knew of Christian claims about Jesus' descent into Sheol and responded with the sharpest counter they could imagine, not a harrowing of hell, but humiliation in it. And here's where it gets interesting. The Talmud doesn't deny the descent. It confirms it. It doesn't say Jesus didn't go to the underworld. It says he did and was punished there, which implies in a backhanded way that even his enemies believed he continued to exist after death, that something happened in the dark. Some scholars argue that this inversion of the Christian harrowing narrative is proof that the early church's claims about the descent were widely known and widely challenged. If it had been a marginal doctrine, why attack it? If it was central, then denying its triumph became a theological imperative. An obscure detail in some medieval commentaries on the Talmud even suggests that Yeshu's punishment was temporary, that his sentence was to last until a certain point in eschatological time. Again, no mainstream rabbi would endorse this today, but the idea lingered, even if only as a distorted reflection of the Christian hope that Jesus' descent had purpose, not punishment. This recalls the imagery of Christ confronting the watchers. There too we see a descent that is not peaceful, but charged with cosmic tension. And just like the watcher's prison, the Talmudic hell is layered, complex, and morally ambiguous. These are not Greek myths or medieval caricatures. They're theological pressure points. Could it be that even his enemies sensed the weight of those 3 days, that even in mockery they bore witness to something they couldn't explain? Modern scholars tend to be cautious here. The Talmud is not a historical record of Jesus' life. It was written long after, and its purpose was not biography, but boundary making. Still, its echoes shouldn't be ignored. It preserves an outsider's memory, a distorted mirror of a man whose story did not end with the tomb. And in that mirror, we see not just disagreement, but fear. If Jesus had truly descended into Sheol, what did that mean for those still waiting there? For those who had claimed to know how the world worked, the Talmud tries to answer with contempt. But in doing so, it admits the question. So was it blasphemy? Yes. Was it mockery? Absolutely. But was it also just maybe a clue? It starts like a fever dream. Isaiah, prophet of old, is lifted into the sky by an angelic guide. They pass through layer upon layer of shimmering realms, 7 heavens in total, each more radiant, more fearsome than the last. And in the highest of these, beyond even the watchers, beyond the wheels and flames and thrones, he sees the Lord. But not just the Lord. He sees something else, a vision of descent, a being of light leaving glory behind, passing downward through the layers concealing his nature as he falls toward earth and beyond. This is the ascension of Isaiah, a pseudepigraphical text that blends prophecy, apocalyptic imagery, and early Christian mysticism. Though excluded from the biblical canon, it was widely read in the first few centuries of the Church. Some early communities considered it authoritative, and like the Book of Enoch, it offers a picture of the universe that is vertical, layered, and alive with spiritual hierarchy. But perhaps its most startling feature is its claim that the descent of the Lord, the pre-incarnate Christ, was not a single leap from heaven to earth, but a slow, deliberate journey through realms both holy and hostile. He passes through each heaven, taking on the appearance of the beings who dwell there, concealing his glory, so that no one suspects his identity. By the time he reaches earth, he is veiled entirely, fragile, human. The text is ethereal, dreamlike, and brimming with esoteric imagery. But buried in its winding path is a potential key to understanding the 3 days in the tomb. Because if Christ descended once from heaven to earth, might he also have descended further from earth into Sheol, into the pit, into the dark heart of death? And if so, did he pass through realms on the way? Were those 3 days not spent in silence but in transit? The structure of the ascension suggests exactly that. Just as Isaiah is guided upward through 7 heavens, Jesus is described as traveling downward in the same order. It's a cosmic mirror, a divine parabola, descent into flesh death, and finally into the underworld itself. And then only then does the ascent begin. What makes this truly haunting is the way the text describes these layers of reality. Each heaven is populated with beings, some holy, others malevolent. The 5th heaven, for example, is said to be home to powers who wage war against the righteous. The 6th contains those who will rise up in the final judgment. By the time you reach the 7th, the air is too bright for words. But beneath them all lies something else. A realm of imprisonment, of decay, of spirits who fell too far. It's not just metaphor, it's a cosmology. And within it, Jesus' journey from death to resurrection becomes more than a blink, it becomes an odyssey. A historical fact worth noting: some early Gnostic sects adopted this layered view of the universe and adapted it to their own ends. In their telling, the divine Christ descended through the archonic layers, confronting false rulers who had hijacked creation. He passed through their domains in disguise, bringing with him a secret knowledge, gnosis, that could liberate the human soul. Heretical, certainly, in the eyes of the Church, but also perhaps preserving fragments of an older story, one that saw the incarnation and resurrection not as isolated events, but as a single descent and return through unseen worlds. The callback to the harrowing of Hades feels particularly resonant here. In both traditions, Christ moves downward, not in defeat, but in strategy. He enters the stronghold of death, not because he must, but because it is part of the design. A cosmic infiltration. One obscure passage in the Ascension even describes the powers of the underworld as recoiling in fear when the Lord draws near. They do not recognize him until it's too late. He has passed through the upper realms unnoticed, cloaked in humility. But when he steps into their darkness, his light becomes undeniable. It's mythic, apocalyptic, and eerily similar to the panic described in the Gospel of Nicodemus, when the gates of Sheol shudder at his voice. Modern readers often dismiss texts like the Ascension of Isaiah as theological fan fiction, too dramatic, too speculative. And yet their persistence in early Christian communities suggests they filled a gap the canonical Gospels did not. What exactly happened during the days the tomb was sealed? Was Jesus simply resting? Or was he on a mission across the metaphysical landscape of creation, reclaiming it layer by layer? Another layer of controversy emerges when considering the structure of time itself in these texts. The seven heavens are not just places, they're modes of being, states, dimensions, which raises the unnerving possibility that Christ's 3 days in the tomb, though short in earthly time, spanned an eternal sweep of action elsewhere. Like a dream that takes hours in the mind, but only seconds in the body. One medieval mystic, echoing the Ascension, wrote that the tomb was the center point of the universe, that from it Christ expanded outward and downward simultaneously, that the silence of the grave was the still point around which the entire cosmos turned. Beautiful nonsense, or a veiled truth spoken in the only language available. Regardless of orthodoxy, the Ascension of Isaiah offers an unblinking view of Jesus as more than a man who died and rose again. It presents him as a traveler between worlds, a being of endless light who passed through shadow not once but twice. And if that's true, then those 3 days weren't empty. They were the climax of a descent that began before Bethlehem and ended with the earth shaking beneath the weight of a God who had touched every corner of his creation, even the ones no one dared speak of. He never met Jesus in the flesh, not on the dusty roads of Galilee, not beneath the olive trees, not even at the cross. And yet Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, became the loudest voice of the early church. His letters are older than the Gospels, his theology sharper than many dared whisper. And in one brief line buried in his letter to the Ephesians, he drops a clue, a glimpse, a riddle. He writes that Christ descended into the lower parts of the earth. What did Paul mean by that? This isn't poetic fluff. It's precise language. And it appears in Ephesians 4:9 in the middle of a passage about Christ's triumph. When he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. But before going up, Paul insists Christ went down, into the depths, into the lower parts. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, but geographically, cosmologically. He doesn't say he died. He says he descended. That's the kind of phrasing that opens wormholes in theology books. One might argue Paul simply meant the incarnation, that Christ came down from heaven into the world. But the language doesn't quite fit. The lower parts of the earth doesn't sound like Judea. It sounds like something under Judea, something ancient, buried, silent. It echoes uncomfortably well the traditions we've explored already. The harrowing, the watchers, the prisons beneath. And though Paul never gives us a gospel narrative, he leaves that to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He does hint that Jesus' resurrection was more than just a dead man waking up. It was a return from somewhere, a comeback from a realm with captives, gifts, and gates. Historically, Paul's letters are the earliest Christian writings we have. The Epistle to the Thessalonians was penned around 50 CE, 2 decades before the Gospel of Mark. Which means when Paul talks about Jesus, he's not quoting stories, he's building a worldview. And that worldview includes a vertical map of reality. In Philippians, Paul writes that Jesus was in the form of God, yet emptied himself, took the form of a servant, and was obedient to death, even death on a cross. That downward movement, God to man, man to servant, servant to corpse, doesn't stop at death. Not for Paul. In Romans, he writes that Jesus died, rose, and now lives and never dies again. But between those 2 points, silence. A sacred blank. Yet there's one more passage that pulls at the veil. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Christ died for our sins, in accordance with the Scriptures, was buried, and rose on the third day. And then he lists appearances to Peter, to the 12, to hundreds. But buried in the rhythm of that list is the assumption that something happened in the in-between. Not seen, not spoken, but necessary. It's important to remember that Paul was a Pharisee by training. He knew the Hebrew Scriptures better than most. He believed in the resurrection of the dead, in angels, in realms beyond human sight. So when he says Jesus descended, he's not being mystical. He's speaking from a framework where Sheol was real, where spirits waited in shadow, and where God's anointed could pass through the land of the dead on his way to the throne. There's also a controversial callback here, a quiet echo of Enoch's story. Paul, though he never names the Book of Enoch, seems aware of traditions about imprisoned angels and spiritual hierarchies. In 1 Corinthians 6, he tells believers they will one day judge angels. What angels? Not the good ones. Not Gabriel. He's referring to fallen beings. And that idea that judgment would reach beyond humanity implies that Christ, as the firstborn from the dead, may have already begun that process. Even Paul's famous metaphor in Colossians that Christ disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public spectacle of them takes on new meaning in this light. What rulers? What authorities? Not Rome, not Herod, something darker, something older. And the imagery of making a public spectacle is especially provocative. It refers to the Roman practice of a triumph, a conquering general parading prisoners through the streets in chains. A show of dominance. If Paul meant this literally, if Jesus truly descended into the lower parts of the earth, then the resurrection wasn't just life after death. It was the exodus of a king returning from a realm where he had torn the gates off their hinges and left the doors swinging. It's no accident that Paul in Ephesians connects Christ's descent with the idea of spiritual gifts. He says that after ascending, Christ gave gifts to men. In ancient military tradition, a victorious general would distribute plunder spoils taken from the defeated. Paul seems to suggest that what Christ gained in the depths, perhaps souls, perhaps authority, perhaps keys, he later distributed to his followers. A lesser-known, yet fascinating tradition claims that when Paul met the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, he was not just converted, he was initiated. That in that flash of light, he saw not just Jesus, but something of where Jesus had been. That the voice from heaven came with echoes of Sheol still clinging to it. Dust from the depths. It's pure speculation, of course. But when you read Paul carefully, you start to see the outlines of a hidden map. Not just of salvation, but of space, of movement, of Christ as a figure who spans the vertical axis of the universe from the highest heavens to the lowest pits and back again. Which brings us back to the tomb, to those silent 3 days. Paul never describes them directly. He doesn't write a timeline. But his theology depends on the idea that Christ's death wasn't a pause, it was a plunge. That resurrection required descent. That exaltation only followed abasement. In the end, Paul didn't see the resurrection the way the others did, but he may have understood it more deeply. And in one quiet verse, a single phrase, he descended into the lower parts of the earth, he may have revealed more about those 3 days than all the gospel writers combined. It's the one day no one talks about. The long silence, the deep breath. Saturday. Good Friday is drenched in blood and tears, a crescendo of suffering and spectacle. Easter Sunday erupts in joy and light. The stone rolled away, and alleluias echoing in vaulted cathedrals. But Saturday is the stillness between, the pause, the void, and yet, Is it, from the perspective of the canonical Gospels, Saturday is almost a narrative dead zone? Matthew notes that the women rested. Mark says little. Luke affirms the Sabbath was observed according to the commandment. John, ever poetic, offers nothing. It's as if the writers collectively stepped back and chose not to speak. But perhaps they weren't avoiding the day. Perhaps they were honoring it. Because in the Jewish tradition, the Sabbath is not just rest, it's sacred rest. Cosmic rest. The seventh day, the day God Himself ceased from labor. So for Jesus to lie in the tomb on the Sabbath is theologically potent. He is quite literally resting from His work. And what work that was! Betrayal, torture, crucifixion, the Lamb of God slain. Now in the cold stone chamber His body is still, a stillness that mirrors the rest of creation. This alone would be rich enough. But the Church Fathers weren't content with symbolic Sabbaths. They asked what was happening while the body rested, where was the soul, and here theology bends back toward action. Because according to ancient doctrine, Holy Saturday wasn't empty. It was full of motion beneath the surface, full of mystery. A day when all was quiet above, but something ancient stirred below. This was the day of the harrowing of hell. Not the loud dramatic descent described in apocryphal gospels or mosaics. No, this was quieter, more surgical. Christ entering Sheol not with trumpet blasts, but with piercing light. It was said that on Holy Saturday, the gates of death were opened from the inside, that Adam and Eve stood blinking in the sudden dawn, that the righteous who had slept for generations stepped forward in awe, and still the world above saw nothing. Sabbath songs were sung, doors were locked, the temple stood cold and uncertain. The disciples, scattered and shaken, did not know what to do with themselves. Their Messiah was dead, buried, gone. They had heard Him speak of resurrection, but who listens clearly through grief? It is a historical fact that by the 3rd century Holy Saturday had become one of the most theologically charged days in the Christian liturgical year. Early church writings refer to it as the Day of Hidden Victory. Some Eastern traditions even hold an evening vigil in which the church is kept completely dark until suddenly the light of Pascha erupts, symbolizing Christ's emergence from the underworld. But what makes Saturday so eerie is precisely this: the dissonance between appearance and reality. Everyone thought Jesus was gone. Rome thought the problem was solved. The temple authorities believed the heresy had been crushed. Even the disciples began to mourn in the finality of death. And all the while, something was happening. The callback to the Gospel of Nicodemus intensifies here. That text describes the underworld trembling gates buckling and the patriarchs rising on Saturday. Not Sunday, Saturday is the moment of reversal. Resurrection might have been the visible unveiling, but the liberation happened while the world waited. One obscure tradition from Coptic Christianity even holds that Saturday is when Jesus found Judas. Not to scorn him, not to punish, but to reach into his despair, to offer even him a path. It's unorthodox, unofficial, but it paints a portrait of Holy Saturday not as justice, but mercy in motion, silent, unseen, and complete. And in that silence is also grief. Mary the mother, Mary Magdalene, John, Peter, the women preparing spices. Their grief wasn't theoretical, it was tactile. The scent of burial oils, the scrape of fabric against stone. They didn't know they were living in a hinge of time. To them, Saturday was the end. That stillness was death's echo. But perhaps that's the power of this missing day. It teaches the weight of waiting. It acknowledges the time between promises and fulfillment, between prayer and answer, between darkness and dawn. Modern theology often rushes past Holy Saturday. It's uncomfortable to sit with uncertainty. We want resolution. We want to flip straight from the cross to the lilies. But faith, the real kind, lives in the Saturday moments. When the stone is still in place. When the miracle hasn't happened yet. When God is silent but something underneath the silence is moving. In recent years, theologians and artists have begun reclaiming Holy Saturday. Poems, meditations, even entire liturgies have arisen around this in-between time. And at the heart of all of them is the same idea: absence that contains presence. Emptiness that is secretly full. If Christ's body lay still, it was because his spirit was in motion. If the tomb was sealed, it was because something far deeper was being broken open. So was Saturday sacred stillness or secret action. Yes, it was the breath before resurrection, the descent beneath despair, the turning of the tide so silent even history didn't hear it. Until, of course, the stone moved. By Sunday morning, everything had changed, but no one could explain how. There was no witness to the actual moment of resurrection. No one saw Jesus' eyes flutter open or his lungs draw in breath again. There were no angels cheering, no symphonies swelling, just an open tomb, just linen cool and empty, just a world somehow tipped off its axis, which raises the uncomfortable question: what exactly happened in that tomb? Was it resurrection, as tradition claims, life restored to a dead body? Or was it something stranger, something beyond biology, something cosmic? The Gospels don't describe the moment of resurrection. They describe the after, the confusion, the empty space, the sudden appearances, and those appearances are odd. Jesus shows up without warning. He walks through walls. He vanishes mid-meal. His followers sometimes recognize him, sometimes don't. He bears wounds, but seems unaffected by them. He eats, but doesn't need to. He ascends into the sky. This isn't a return to normal life. This is a return from somewhere else, which is precisely what many early Christians believed. In the earliest liturgical texts of the Church, Christ's resurrection isn't just described as revival, it's described as emergence. Like a traveler stepping back from a foreign land. A hero returning from battle in a far-off kingdom. The language echoes myth, yes, but not fantasy. Pattern, archetype. A cycle that predates the Gospels and shows up in traditions across the world. The Egyptian Osiris torn apart and restored. The Sumerian Inanna who descends into the underworld and returns crowned with new power. The Greek Persephone emerging from Hades as the seasons shift. These are not copied myths, but they're signals, literary fingerprints that suggest resurrection was never meant to be clinical. It was always meant to be transformative. Not just resuscitation, but recreation. This is a historically verifiable pattern in mythological studies. The so-called death and return God motif appears in multiple cultures. But what sets the Jesus narrative apart is not just that he returns, but that he changes. He is not what he was. And this transformation is not just personal, it's universal. It affects the world, time, space, death itself. Some theologians have leaned into this idea by suggesting that Jesus didn't simply revive, he returned from another realm. That his 3 days were not passive hours spent in waiting, but active time in a different dimension of existence. That what rose from the tomb wasn't merely healed flesh, but glorified being. The same, but not the same. A callback to Paul's letters sharpens this. Paul calls the risen Jesus the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, not just the first to come back, but the prototype of a new kind of life, a new kind of human. one capable of moving through both death and time like an author moving through the pages of a book. And what if that new life didn't come from within the tomb, but from beyond it? The Gospel of John offers a peculiar moment when Mary Magdalene, seeing the risen Jesus, mistakes him for a gardener. When she finally realizes who he is and reaches for him, he says, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." It's a strange sentence. Chilling almost. What does it mean? Why couldn't she touch him? What state was he in? Where had he been? Some interpreters believe this suggests a liminal phase, a moment where Jesus stood between worlds. Not yet ascended, no longer dead. A threshold being. And in that state, perhaps even his own closest friends couldn't understand him. One obscure line from the Gospel of Peter, an apocryphal text, describes the cross itself emerging from the tomb, speaking in a loud voice. It's theatrical, absurd even. But it points toward a deep instinct among early Christians that something happened in the tomb that broke the rules of reality. The laws of physics weren't just bent, they were rewritten. Modern theologians and scientists alike have played with this. Some suggest the resurrection represents a quantum event matter, phasing in and out of known existence. Others, more poetic, describe it as a wormhole of grace, a cosmic tear through which eternity leaked into time. These are metaphors, of course. But they all circle the same idea: resurrection wasn't just biological, it was dimensional. A controversial but thought-provoking idea appears in certain early mystical texts that Jesus didn't merely rise. He returned like a soldier from behind enemy lines. That the tomb was not a chamber but a passage. That those 3 days were not countdown time, but journey time. That Christ moved through layers of creation, broke seals, shattered gates, and came back changed. And if that's true, then he didn't just survive death. He mastered it. Which brings us back to the strange behavior of the risen Christ. Why didn't he go directly to Pontius Pilate, to the temple? To the crowds who shouted, "Crucify"? Why appear only to a handful of followers in secluded places at odd times? Perhaps because he no longer belonged fully to this world. Perhaps he was already halfway gone. The callback to the folded linen intensifies this idea. That tidy arrangement was not the sign of a man rushing out of the grave. It was the mark of a traveler who'd completed his journey. Who had gone somewhere unspeakable, returned victorious, and left behind a clue. So was the resurrection a medical miracle? Or was it the climax of a cosmic voyage, maybe both? Or maybe neither? Maybe it was the moment when time blinked, when death flinched, when the veil between worlds grew thin enough for one man to pass through, not back to what was, but forward into what will be. And from there, he walked into the morning light. It reads like poetry, but cuts like a scalpel. The Gospel of Philip, discovered in the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945, is not a storybook. It isn't a narrative of Jesus' life or death. It's a tangled web of sayings, metaphors, riddles, and paradoxes stitched together with a tone that feels half ancient and half futuristic. And buried inside it, among passages about sacred unions and spiritual rebirth, lies a striking idea that what happened to Jesus in death wasn't just resurrection, it was transfiguration, a change in essence, a transformation into something entirely new. To the Gnostics, death wasn't the end, it was the molting of a shell, the escape from a lower world governed by blind forces, what they called the archons, and a return to the fullness of the divine. Jesus, in their theology, didn't die to pay a debt. He died to demonstrate the escape route, a prototype of awakening. The Gospel of Philip states that those who say that the Lord died first and then rose are in error, for he rose first, and then died. A paradox, yes, but also a declaration of cosmic reversal. In Gnostic thinking, resurrection isn't a comeback, it's an unveiling. Death doesn't cause transformation. Transformation causes the defeat of death. To traditional Christian theology, this is deeply heretical. But as a historical fact, it's undeniable that these ideas were circulating by the 2nd century. They weren't fringe thoughts whispered in caves. They were full-blown cosmologies, competing Christianities. And in these versions of the story, Jesus' time in the tomb wasn't about waiting for life to return, it was the final stage of metamorphosis. And here's where it gets fascinating. The tomb in Gnostic imagery often represents the world itself, the body, matter. It's not just a physical place, but a prison, a veil. In one fragment, the tomb is described as the place where light was clothed in shadow, which means the resurrection is not merely an event, it's an escape. Some Gnostic writings hint that Jesus' body after resurrection was no longer material in the traditional sense. It could appear and disappear. It wasn't bound by gravity or doors. Sound familiar? The canonical Gospels show Jesus doing exactly this, walking through locked rooms, appearing beside travelers without being recognized, disappearing at will. This isn't just dramatization. It might be residue-lingering echoes from a deeper tradition. One obscure saying in the Gospel of Philip describes the transformation of Jesus as a bridal chamber, a sacred union between flesh and spirit, earth and heaven. It sounds esoteric, almost alien, but it aligns in its own symbolic language with the idea that death for Jesus wasn't a destination, it was an alchemical process. The tomb wasn't where his story paused, it was where it ignited. A callback here to Paul's letters sharpens the point. Paul speaks of resurrection as the transition from perishable to imperishable, from natural to spiritual body. Gnostics took that idea and ran with it. For them, Jesus' death allowed him to shed the last vestiges of human limitation. The resurrection body wasn't just a healed body, it was light made visible. And if that's what happened in the tomb, then those 3 days were not passive, they were active. The way a caterpillar does not simply lie still in its cocoon. Something is working in the dark. The body isn't being repaired, it's being rewritten. This interpretation makes sense of certain details in the Gospels that otherwise seem strange. Why do people fail to recognize Jesus? Why does he forbid Mary Magdalene from touching him at first, but later invites Thomas to do exactly that? Why does he ask for food, yet seem to have no real need for it? The pattern suggests a being who is slipping in and out of reality. Not ghost, not man. Something other. Even more chilling is the implication for those he left behind. If Jesus transfigured within the tomb, he left a template. The Gnostics taught that each person contained a divine spark, a shard of the same light that burned within Christ. His resurrection then wasn't just an endpoint. It was an instruction manual, a cosmic jailbreak guide hidden in metaphor and mystery. Of course, mainstream Christianity rejected these ideas. The Gnostic Gospels were condemned, their texts burned, their followers branded heretics. But the questions they asked about what kind of change Jesus underwent in death, about what resurrection really meant, refused to die. Because they echo something the canonical texts are too restrained to say outright, that whatever happened inside the tomb, it wasn't just resuscitation, it was evolution. Which leads to a final and perhaps the most radical Gnostic claim that the resurrection was not a return to this world at all. It was an exit. That the appearances of the risen Christ were projections, echoes, glimpses of a being who no longer belonged in the system, who had ascended beyond it. who, having passed through all layers of creation, now returned only briefly to whisper what he had seen. The traditionalists call this blasphemy. The mystics call it truth. Either way, it's a clue. He doesn't say, "I came back to life." He doesn't say, "I was unconscious" or "I rested for a while." No, the risen Jesus in the opening vision of Revelation speaks in thunderous finality, "I was dead, and now I am alive forevermore. And I hold the keys of death and Hades." It's not just a statement of resurrection, it's a declaration of dominion, of territory reclaimed, of doors unlocked. By the time Revelation was written, likely near the end of the 1st century, Christianity had already begun its transformation from a whispered resistance movement to a sprawling, complex theology. And within it, Jesus was no longer just the teacher or miracle worker. He was the cosmic king, the Lamb on the throne, the one who had descended into the very bowels of reality and returned, altered. But it's the phrase, "I hold the keys," that unlocks an entirely new angle on the 3 days in the tomb. Because keys imply ownership, authority, passage. You don't get keys unless you've been inside, unless you've claimed it from someone else. Jesus doesn't just rise, he rises with something, a new kind of access. This ties into an ancient belief already examined through the Harrowing of Hades, that Christ, during the Silent Saturday, invaded the underworld. But Revelation pushes it further. He didn't just harrow, he conquered. He took possession of realms that were once ruled by other forces, death personified in myth and feared in flesh. Hades, the shadowy holding ground of souls. Both now stand symbolically, at least under Jesus' authority. And here's where the callback to the Gospel of Nicodemus and its dramatic underworld courtroom gains force. Because if Jesus truly confronted these realms, if he pulled the righteous out and locked the gates behind him, then holding the keys is not metaphor. It's narrative closure, a visible artifact of an invisible war. But of course, Revelation is drenched in symbolism. Beasts, thrones, rivers of crystal. Can we really take Jesus' words literally? That depends on how you read the book. Some scholars see it as allegory, others as prophecy coded in metaphor. But regardless of your interpretive lens, one thing is clear. The voice speaking those words is not describing a gentle nap in the tomb. I was dead. The Greek is stark, egonomen nekros, I became dead. Not figuratively, not symbolically. And then kai idou zon emi eis tos ionas ton ionon, and behold, I am living into the ages of the ages. There's an absoluteness to it. Not just back from the dead. Beyond it. This ties directly to a peculiar and lesser-known early Christian tradition, preserved in some liturgies, the idea that when Jesus rose, he didn't just rise vertically, he rose through time. That his resurrection paradoxically affected both the past and the future. That his voice echoed backward through the graveyards of history, waking saints long dead. A retroactive salvation. The Gospel of Matthew even hints at this bizarre reality. When Jesus dies, it says the earth quakes, tombs open, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Not after the resurrection, during it. As if the moment of his death punched a hole through time. A foreshock of Easter. It's the kind of detail most sermons skip. Too strange, too cinematic. But in Revelation, we see that cosmic tension fully realized. The risen Christ is not merely alive, he is sovereign. He stands not just beyond death, but over it. An obscure Gnostic text. The dialogue of the Savior presents an odd image of Christ, speaking to his disciples post-resurrection. He tells them, I am not a spirit without flesh, nor am I a body without soul, but I am from above. It's a confusing claim, but one that hints at transformation. Jesus didn't just get his old body back. He got something more, something no longer confined to the rules of this plane. This could explain his strange post-resurrection behavior. Why he appears suddenly even through locked doors. Why his disciples sometimes fail to recognize him. Why he ascends into heaven not as a fading ghost, but as a radiant being that commands worship. Not because he simply survived death, but because he transcended it, altered it. The callback to Paul becomes sharper now. When Paul says death has been swallowed up in victory, he's quoting from Isaiah, but he's also speaking from a belief that death is no longer what it once was. That Christ didn't just defeat death, he unwrote it, changed its shape, flipped it inside out. But if Jesus now holds the keys to death and Hades, what does that mean for everyone else? Did the locks change? Is death still the same for us as it was before that Sunday morning? Early Christians didn't think so. Their fearlessness in the face of martyrdom, their insistence on burial over cremation, their songs sung at gravesides, all point to a profound shift. They no longer saw death as an ending. It had become a door, and more importantly, it was a door their master now had the key to. And so when Jesus says, "I was dead, and now I am alive forevermore," he's not just describing his journey, he's issuing a declaration. The tomb didn't trap him. It became his throne room. He didn't just come back from somewhere. He owns it now. The tomb has always been treated as a boundary, a line in the sand. Before it lies life. Beyond it, the undiscovered country. In most traditions, the tomb is the end, final, cold, and unchangeable. But what if Jesus' burial site wasn't a stopping point, but a threshold? What if it was never meant to be a place of rest, but of passage? In the earliest Christian mysticism, echoes of this idea appear again and again, the notion that the tomb was not merely a grave, but a portal. And it's not as metaphorical as modern ears might expect. Burial caves in first-century Judea weren't deep underground crypts. They were shallow, often family-owned stone chambers carved into limestone. Yet the way the Gospels describe Jesus' tomb is filled with layered language, the stone rolled away, the angels descending the inner garments left behind, as if shed in transformation. It's as if the act of resurrection didn't merely involve the body standing up, it involved passing through something unseen, a kind of veil. This brings us to an unusual link, the rituals of the mystery religions. Across the Mediterranean world in Jesus' time, secretive cults often centered on death, rebirth, and hidden wisdom thrived in parallel with early Christianity. From the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece to the cult of Mithras in Rome, these movements often involved initiations that mimicked death only for the initiate to symbolically rise reborn. In some rites, a sacred cavern or tomb-like chamber was used. In others, an underground passage, always a liminal space, always a moment of passage. In the Mithraic mysteries, for example, the initiate would pass through a series of stages, each guarded by a deity, each requiring symbolic death and rebirth. The final stage union with Mithras was believed to offer eternal life. Sound, familiar scholars have debated for centuries whether Christianity borrowed from these cults or whether these groups simply tapped into the same human yearning. But the structural similarity to the tomb as portal motif is striking. And then there's the stone, a seemingly mundane object, yet the Gospels make a dramatic point of it. The stone is rolled away, not simply to let Jesus out, but to let witnesses in, as if the very act of moving that boundary stone had cosmic significance. In Jewish tradition, Stones were used to seal covenants, mark sacred sites, and represent divine authority. Rolling the stone away isn't just about access, it's about reversal. What was closed is now open. What was final is now beginning. An obscure mystical text, the Odes of Solomon, likely dating from the 2nd century, contains a haunting passage: Sheol saw me and was shattered, and death ejected me in fear. I made a congregation of living among the dead. The speaker is unclear, perhaps it's Jesus, perhaps a stylized soul, but the imagery is unmistakable. A descent, a confrontation, and then a return, not alone, but with others. This concept also echoes in Coptic texts, especially in fragments found at Nag Hammadi. In some of the Gnostic Gospels, Jesus describes the material world as a prison, the body as a garment, and death as the final illusion. In one striking dialogue, he says, "Do not weep for the body, for the tomb is but a curtain, like the one in the temple that tore in two when he died, a veil lifted, a threshold breached." All of this leads to an unnerving possibility that the tomb was not merely the setting of resurrection, but its mechanism, a device, a liminal chamber where time-bent rules shifted and dimensions touched. The idea may sound wild, even esoteric, but it's consistent with the strange behavior seen post-resurrection. Jesus walking through walls, appearing in different forms, eating food, yet not always recognizable. The man who went into the tomb isn't quite the same as the one who emerged. And this is where we must recall an earlier point, the idea from the Gospel of Philip, that resurrection begins before death, that the transformation is already underway. If that's true, the tomb doesn't just mark a boundary in time, it marks a process, a chrysalis, not a coffin. One early Christian bishop, Gregory of Nyssa, described the tomb as the narrow gateway through which the boundless kingdom of heaven is entered. Not poetic license, but perhaps a theological cartography, mapping the unseen geography of death with the tomb as the pressure point between worlds. And it's not only Christian tradition that toys with this threshold concept. Ancient Egyptian burial chambers were deliberately constructed as symbolic portals filled with spells, starscapes, and guides for the soul. Tibetan sky burials aim to dissolve the body into the elements so the soul may pass unimpeded. In Norse myth, the dead travel across a bridge. In Greek lore, the river Styx must be crossed with coin in hand. Always there is movement, a barrier, a gate. Even Jesus' placement in a new tomb, one in which no one had yet been laid, carries a curious resonance, symbolically pure, uncontaminated by other deaths. It becomes a blank canvas, a controlled environment for a transformation unlike anything the world had seen. And what if the tomb wasn't just a passageway, but a meeting place, a thin place, as the Celts would say? A location where dimensions blur and travelers pass through in both directions. Could that explain the reported angelic presences, the early depictions of Christ in descent, surrounded by crowds of figures, some human, some not? The Gospels don't describe the resurrection event itself. No eyewitness account of the moment Jesus moves, only aftermath. As if the moment of passage was too strange to frame in words, too luminous, or too layered. Perhaps that silence is the clue. Perhaps what happened inside the tomb wasn't something that could be seen. It had to be crossed. The earth shook, the sky darkened. Graves broke open, and the dead walked. That's what Matthew tells us. Not in poetic metaphor, not as a parable, but as events that occurred the moment Jesus died. It's tempting to dismiss them as symbolic. Surely earthquakes and reanimated saints are the stuff of myth, not history. And yet buried within these extraordinary claims may be signs, strange, unsettling signs, that the laws of nature briefly trembled in those 3 tomb-bound days. First, the darkness. According to the Synoptic Gospels, a strange eclipse of sorts settled over the land from the 6th to the 9th hour on the day of crucifixion. That's roughly noon to 3 in the afternoon. Some have tried to explain it as a natural eclipse, but Passover is celebrated during a full moon, making a solar eclipse physically impossible. Lunar eclipses don't produce total darkness in daylight. So what was it? The early church fathers treated the darkness as real and symbolic creation itself, grieving the death of its maker. But ancient historians outside the Christian tradition may have noticed something too. The Greek writer Phlegon, a pagan chronicler in the 2nd century, recorded a great eclipse of the sun during the reign of Tiberius and a subsequent earthquake in Bithynia. He didn't name Jesus, but the overlap is suggestive. A disruption, a moment when heaven and earth convulsed together. Next came the quake. Matthew alone reports it, but his detail is curious. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. This isn't just background tremor, it's apocalyptic. Geologists have even examined core samples around the Dead Sea and found evidence of a significant seismic event in the Jerusalem area between 26 and 36 CE. Again, it's not proof, but the timing is uncomfortably tight. But perhaps most curious are the open graves. Matthew claims that many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. That's a lot. Yet no other gospel writer mentions this. No historian records a zombie parade through downtown Jerusalem, which raises the question, was it literal visionary or something in between? Some theologians believe Matthew was drawing on Ezekiel's vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, a prophetic metaphor for national restoration. Others suggest it was a way of showing that Jesus' death and resurrection had cosmic consequences, loosening the grip of death, not just on himself, but on others. Still, the language used is jarringly specific. They came out of the tombs, and the detail that it happened after Jesus rose curiously precise for a symbolic flourish. One theory suggests that what Matthew describes isn't a historical crowd scene, but a glimpse of a larger metaphysical release. The dead emerging, yes, but not in flesh and bone. Perhaps in vision, or dream, or brief ghostly encounter. The early church was steeped in the belief that Christ broke the power of death for all the righteous who had come before. Maybe in a moment of rupture, some souls made contact. And here we must remember the earlier tradition of the harrowing of Hades, that Jesus descended to the realm of the dead, not to suffer, but to liberate. The earthquake becomes not just geological, but spiritual, a shaking of the very underworld. The darkness not just atmospheric, but metaphysical, and the open graves not horror, but rescue. We might also revisit a strange parallel from Roman myth. When Julius Caesar was assassinated, legend says the sun was blotted out for days. Comets appeared. Animals gave birth to monsters. Historians may scoff, but the message was clear: the universe reacts when something divine dies. Could the gospel authors have absorbed a similar cultural expectation? Or were they describing a deeper truth, a moment when reality bent? The idea of nature responding to the death of a holy figure isn't unique to Christianity. In Buddhist tradition, earthquakes accompanied the moment of the Buddha's enlightenment, and again at his death. In Mesoamerican belief, solar eclipses were feared as omens of divine displeasure. Over and over, cultures interpreted cosmic disturbances as signs from beyond. When the normal rhythms of sky and stone break, something sacred has shifted. But the gospel writers aren't merely invoking signs, they're linking those signs to something else. The veil in the temple torn in two. The centurion, a Roman, no less proclaiming Jesus as the Son of God. The natural and supernatural entwined. And all of it happening not in the moment of resurrection, but death. As if the power released by Jesus' death reverberated beyond his body. The world cracked before the tomb opened. Interestingly, early Christian mystics saw these portents not as side effects, but as symptoms of a cosmic surgery, something being unstitched and rewoven. When Jesus gave up his spirit, the curtain that separated the Holy of Holies was torn, not gently, but from top to bottom. Not man to God, but God to man. Access granted, barrier removed. And isn't it peculiar that we've already seen another curtain, a veil between life and death? The tomb in many ways mirrored the temple, enclosed sacred, entered only by the chosen. And just as the veil in the temple was torn, perhaps the veil within the tomb was pierced. It's easy to forget that death in ancient Jewish tradition was considered a place, a location, Sheol, the pit, a realm, not a condition, and realms can quake. Realms can be breached. The darkness, the earthquake, the graves, whether literal or not, point to a single idea, something fundamental shifted. And it wasn't quiet. It wasn't gentle. The silence of the Gospels may conceal a truth far louder, a moment when heaven bent low and hell let go. When the ground beneath Jerusalem cracked, not just to reveal bodies but to mark a passage. Because what if the stone was rolled away after the real event? What if by the time the women arrived at the tomb, the shaking had already passed, the rupture had already healed, and what stood before them was not the place of death, but the trace of crossing? A shockwave leaves no voice, but it leaves a silence shaped like awe. There is a moment in one of the strangest texts of early Christianity where the cross itself begins to walk. Not metaphorically, not in vision, not as a poetic flourish, but literally stepping forth from the tomb like a silent, towering witness. Welcome to the Gospel of Peter, a text long buried, long banned, and still capable of making scholars pause and reread with raised eyebrows. Discovered in the late 19th century in a monk's tomb in Egypt, this apocryphal gospel had been lost for over a millennium. It had survived in fragments quoted suspiciously by early bishops who warned of its docetic tendencies, that is, the belief that Jesus only seemed to suffer and die. But until that dusty manuscript emerged from the sand, no one had seen its full story. And what a story it tells. The Gospel of Peter begins in familiar territory, the trial, crucifixion, and burial of Jesus. But the details are off-skewed just enough to feel like a fever dream of the canonical Gospels. Herod, not Pilate, is blamed for the execution. Jesus remains eerily silent, described as feeling no pain. And after he dies, strange cosmic signs appear yet again with the darkness and earthquakes. But the real strangeness begins after the tomb is sealed. 2 Roman guards are posted. A great crowd gathers to watch. A voice comes from the heavens. And then the tomb opens by itself. Out step 2 massive figures whose heads reach the sky. Between them, a third figure is led someone they support someone smaller. It is, we assume, the risen Christ. And behind them, from the tomb, comes the cross. Upright. Walking. On its own. Now let's be clear. No other text, canonical or apocryphal, contains anything like this. A talking donkey in the Old Testament, sure. Floating wheels covered in eyes, Ezekiel's got you. But a cross on legs, that's a new one. And yet in this strange imagery lies something worth pausing over. The cross doesn't just walk. it speaks. A voice from heaven asks, "Have you preached to those who sleep?" And the cross answers yes. What are we to do with that? One possibility is that this moment symbolizes the unity of Jesus and the cross, the instrument of death, transformed into a messenger of life. In the Gospel of Peter, the cross becomes not just a tool of execution, but a witness, a participant, a bearer of truth. It has seen the descent into death. It has seen the silence of the tomb, and now it walks out as proof. But others take it further. In some early Christian traditions, the cross itself was almost personified, a cosmic object, like the tree of life imbued with divine significance. Some Eastern Orthodox hymns speak of the cross as a bridge, a weapon, even a companion. In that light, its animation in this gospel becomes less cartoonish and more mystical. The cross is not wood, but a character, a relic with memory. The canonical Gospels are silent about what happened in the tomb. The Gospel of Peter is not. It offers a theatrical, almost psychedelic sequence, a kind of sacred drama that implies something enormous occurred, something that needed giants, angels, and yes, even a mobile crucifix to convey. And yet this gospel was quickly branded heresy. Church leaders like Serapion of Antioch condemned it not only for its docetic theology, but for its narrative excesses. The idea that Jesus did not physically suffer or die threatened the very foundation of the Incarnation. But beneath the doctrinal disputes, there was likely something else that made the Gospel of Peter dangerous. It tried to fill in the blanks. Orthodox Christianity left the tomb closed. From Friday evening to Sunday morning, the curtain was drawn. But this text threw it open, and what it revealed was too strange, too bold, too visual to be tolerated. It didn't just hint at Jesus harrowing hell. It staged the scene. And therein lies the question. Why would someone invent a story in which the cross walks and speaks? What theological or symbolic need did that fulfill? One theory points to the early church's discomfort with mystery. The silence of the Gospels may have felt like a gap, a narrative vacuum. People wanted to know. What happened in the tomb? Was Jesus alone? Did anything transpire in those shadowed hours? In response, some writers created visions, dramatic, vivid, unsettling visions, and the Gospel of Peter may have been one of them, a spiritual theater, a myth with sharp teeth. But perhaps it wasn't simply an invention. The imagery in the Gospel of Peter bears strange echoes of Jewish apocalyptic literature, where objects can speak, angels tower like mountains, and heaven opens with a voice like thunder. In that world, a walking cross isn't absurd. It's a signal, a sign that death itself has been upended. And this text connects curiously with the supernatural elements we've already seen: the earthquake, the open graves, the torn veil. Each is a breach, a moment when the world split open and something else, something older, deeper, holier, stepped through. The Gospel of Peter merely made the breach visible. Still, we must admit the unease it creates. A Jesus who feels no pain, a tomb that opens without touch, a cross that walks like a man and answers questions from the sky. These aren't images of comfort. They are surreal, even disturbing. But they may also be a coded way of saying something happened that cannot be explained. So we dress it in dream. We may never know how seriously this gospel was taken. Was it liturgy legend or late-night fiction? What we do know is that it was read, copied, buried with monks, which means someone somewhere found truth in it, or at least needed it to be true. And that's the deeper thread running through every attempt to narrate those 3 days. Whether through theology or hallucination, creed or creativity, early Christians tried to map the space between death and resurrection. The Gospel of Peter dared to sketch the contours, and in doing so, it gave us something even the canonical texts could not: a door creaking open and a shadow stepping out. Not a ghost, not a metaphor, but a cross walking into the light. Imagine trying to build a faith around an empty space. That's what early Christianity had to do. Between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, there was a silence, an abyss really into which no gospel dared peer too deeply. But heresies. Heresies filled the void with abandon. For if orthodoxy hesitated to narrate those lost hours, the so-called heretics weren't nearly so shy. In fact, some of the most persistent early Christian deviations orbit around what did or didn't happen during Jesus' time in the tomb. To understand why, we need to rewind to the first few centuries when Christianity was less a unified religion than a family feud conducted in whispers and letters across the Mediterranean. There were Ebionites who saw Jesus as a purely human Messiah, Essene-like mystics, who spoke in riddles, and Doxatists, who insisted that Jesus never truly died at all. And in between a dozen shades of proto-Christianity, each with its own gospel calendar and theory of the tomb, Doxatism in particular offers a strange window into this hidden time. The term comes from the Greek dokin, meaning to seem. According to these thinkers, Jesus only seemed to suffer and die. His divine essence could never be touched by blood or decay, which meant that the Passion wasn't a sacrifice, it was a spectacle, a teaching moment, a mirage. In their telling, the tomb was never occupied by the divine at all. Either the divine Christ had departed before the cross, or another had taken his place. This echoes a controversial thread in Islamic tradition as well, where some interpretations of the Quran suggest that Jesus was not crucified, but that someone was made to appear like him. These ideas, while theologically jarring to orthodoxy, reflect an ancient discomfort with the image of God dying. And they also curiously attempt to solve the mystery of the tomb by denying its necessity. Marcionites, meanwhile, posed a different threat. Marcion of Sinope, a 2nd-century shipowner turned theologian, proposed that the God of Jesus was not the wrathful deity of the Hebrew Scriptures, but a higher, more merciful being. His Jesus descended like a phantom, bypassed birth, rejected the material world, and most crucially resurrected not from death, but from below the surface of this broken realm. His tomb wasn't a resting place, it was an exit route. These ideas may seem wild today, but they held sway for decades, sometimes centuries. Why? Because they spoke to a deep uncertainty in the early Christian imagination. The death of Jesus was real, yes. But what happened next? The resurrection was proclaimed with fire and trumpets. But the middle chapter, the shadowed pause between crucifixion and dawn, remained narratively starved. So the heresies rushed in. Gnostic texts like those found at Nag Hammadi painted Jesus as a cosmic trickster. In one account, he laughs at the crucifixion from a nearby hill, having cast off his bodily form like an old coat. In another, he appears to his followers immediately after death. His tone amused, his wounds irrelevant. These visions don't focus on pain or triumph. They dwell in that suspended moment, the time when Jesus is dead, yet not gone, silent, yet still speaking. And then there were the Montanists, a prophetic movement that expected Christ's imminent return not from heaven, but from the ground. They waited for his voice to rise again, not from the clouds, but from the tombs. For them, the 3 days weren't a completed chapter, but a recurring cycle, a pattern that echoed each time the earth rumbled or the veil thinned. Orthodox writers pushed back with increasing force. Irenaeus, Tertullian, Athanasius all sharpened their pens against these movements. They defended the bodily death, the physical entombment, the literal rising. But in their very defenses, they acknowledged the pressure. People were asking, what happened in those days? Why don't the Gospels explain? Why does Matthew include earthquakes and zombies while Mark ends with silence and fear? The answer may lie in what was at stake. To narrate the tomb is to define the mechanics of the resurrection, and that for early Christianity was dangerous territory. If Jesus battled demons, did he suffer in death? If he descended into hell, was he ever truly God? If the cross walked, did the laws of nature bend or break? Better perhaps to leave it unsaid, to trust mystery over myth. But the heresies remind us of something crucial. That silence was never passive. It was fertile. It invited speculation, storytelling, rebellion. The blank page between the cross and the empty tomb became a canvas for alternative gospels, cosmic dramas, metaphysical puzzles. Not because people wanted to undermine the resurrection, but because they wanted to understand it, to touch it, to fill the tomb with something more than stone and linen. And so across the early centuries, as the Church carved out its canon, it did so in the shadow of texts that asked forbidden questions. Did Jesus suffer in spirit, or only in flesh? Was the tomb a place of rest or a portal? Did something happen in those hours that changed everything but left no trace? Even today, traces linger in obscure liturgies, in the symbolism of Holy Saturday, in the nervous glances of theologians when asked plainly, where was Jesus really? For as much as orthodoxy claims certainty, there's a quiet confession beneath it. All 3 days are missing. Not from the calendar, from the narrative, from the record. And where the official story steps back, the early heresies step forward. They may not hold the truth, but they refuse to let the mystery rest. Let's breathe in slowly now. We're nearing the end. The tomb is just ahead, cool, dark, still sealed. You've walked with me through sacred texts and silent centuries past doctrine and heresy, through whispers in catacombs and visions in cosmic heavens. And now, after all the echoes and fragments, all the hints tucked between the lines, we must ask, what might have truly happened during those hidden days? No single answer will satisfy. That's the curse and charm of this mystery. But what we can do is listen for the melody that lingers behind the words, the harmony between orthodox proclamations and suppressed gospels, the rhythm in the silence, the ghost of a narrative lost and half-remembered. First, we must accept that the canonical Gospels are not biographies in the modern sense. They are theological portraits. Their silence on the tomb time is deliberate. It is not forgetfulness, it's reverence. Like a moment of held breath in a liturgy. But to the earliest believers, especially those shaped by Second Temple Judaism, silence wasn't always emptiness. It could be a veil. That veil may conceal a descent not into a fiery hell, but into Sheol, the realm of the dead. Not punishment, but pause. Tradition long held that the righteous waited in Abraham's bosom, a spiritual holding place distinct from damnation. And early Christian imagination, especially seen in apocryphal texts like the Gospel of Nicodemus, was ablaze with visions of Jesus storming its gates, proclaiming liberation to Adam, Eve, David, the prophets, the just, who died in hope. This is not merely metaphor. It reflects a cosmic reckoning. The Messiah doesn't just conquer death by resurrecting, he enters it, empties it, reclaims it. Like a king returning from war bearing the keys of a vanquished kingdom. Perhaps that's why Revelation describes him saying, I hold the keys of death and Hades. Those keys weren't handed to him. He took them. But how? Through what mechanism? And did anything physical occur during those hours? Let's return to the Shroud of Turin, not as proof, but as poetry. If the image burned into the linen is authentic, it suggests something far beyond mere bodily reanimation. The image is delicate, superficial, inexplicably encoded in a way that has puzzled physicists for decades. Some speculate radiation, others suggest a quantum-level event. Still others propose a dimensional shift. Not resurrection as revival, but resurrection as translocation, as if Christ passed through death like a veil, and the tomb recorded the trace of that passage. And then there are those strange moments in Matthew. Earthquakes, opened graves, the curtain of the temple torn top to bottom. Are these metaphors for cosmic upheaval, or thinly veiled references to something unearthly? Some say that what the ancients described with sacred awe, we might today call an interdimensional breach, or a collapse in the barrier between the seen and unseen. Another possibility, that Jesus underwent a process of transfiguration while dead, a metamorphosis of being. Gnostic texts, for all their heretical flair, often hint that the crucifixion wasn't the end of transformation, but the midpoint. That what emerged from the tomb was not the same entity that had been buried. And maybe that's why Mary Magdalene didn't recognize him at first. Maybe that's why he could appear in locked rooms, ascend in clouds, or walk beside his disciples without being known. Still, some scholars suggest that the silence itself is the answer. That the tomb time was about rest, not action. That after the agony, Jesus entered into the Sabbath, the ultimate Holy Saturday. A pause. A cosmic breath between two realities. In that stillness, the world recalibrated. And yet, it's hard not to feel that something did happen. That silence wasn't the absence of movement, but the hiding of it. If we're being honest, every theory, orthodox or esoteric, has gaps. Every tradition holds its mystery. Perhaps that's the point. The 3 days in the tomb resist explanation because they belong not only to history, but to myth. Not fantasy, but sacred story. Story that stretches across time, rooted in fact, but woven with the intangible. It's the space where theology and physics shake hands, where dreams meet doctrine, and you, dear listener, have followed each thread through art and scripture, burial cloth, and apocrypha, pagan myth, and church creed. What might have truly happened may be a journey through dimensions, maybe a quiet liberation of souls, maybe the stillest silence ever held, or maybe something we don't have words for yet. What matters is that something changed. The world before those 3 days was not the same as the world after. The veil was thinner, the stone had moved, and somewhere between dusk and dawn, history cracked open, just enough for light to spill through. You're still here. The stone has rolled away, the story has been told, and yet you linger. That's all right. Some stories echo louder in silence. So let's sit a little longer together here at the edge of the garden. The dawn is pale. The grave clothes are folded. And something feels different. The tomb in all its finality wasn't just a place of death. It was a chamber outside of time. A place where clocks stopped but transformation continued. Maybe that's why we're drawn to it, not because it marks an ending, but because it hums with something unfinished, something sacred. They say time inside a dream feels slower, or faster, or strange. The same might be true for the Son of Man wrapped in linen, poised between worlds. What if those 3 days were not measured in hours, but in ruptures of space, of spirit, of self? You've wandered with me through gospel gaps and hidden scrolls, unsealed graves and silent liturgies. You've seen Jesus mocked, buried, glorified, and somewhere in the middle changed. And now, as we return to this strange moment in history, we must admit that it's not entirely behind us. It lives, in questions, in wonder, in that brief stillness before sunrise. So let yourself slow. Let the stone stay rolled back. Let your breath match the rhythm of the early morning wind. Nothing rushes here. The veil between death and life has grown thin. You can almost see through it now, can't you? The tomb isn't a prison anymore. It's a door. Not just for him, but for you too. You came here looking for what happened in those hidden days. What you found was a question that reshapes the world. And perhaps that's enough for now. Sleep well, seeker. The stone will still be rolled away when you wake.